Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Wonderful Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Awakened Dragon Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. For Izuku, there really was nothing quite like a home-cooked meal. It was uncanny how just with a few bites of his mother's food, he felt like a little kid again. That same steady need for comfort and his mother that had barely let up even as he'd gotten older. Izuku had always been small for his age, always felt even smaller than that. It made it easy for his mom to wrap her arms around her son, able to provide a steady comfort at all times. Her warmth always made Izuku feel vulnerable, both like it was too much and yet not enough at the same time. He loved his mother. No one could truly send him back to his childhood like the lovely woman could through just a simple meal. Yes, Izuku loved his mother a lot. No matter how out of place he felt, how uncomfortable in his own skin, she was always there to provide her baby with anything he needed. Since moving into dorms, Izuku really missed that comfort. It was fine at first. Getting used to his classmates was difficult, but tolerable. He loved learning more about who they were outside of their quirks. But even after just a week away from home, Izuku started to feel off. Stress could do strange things. His body ached constantly, day and night, feeling like his joints were stretching outwards then squeezing in again in pulsating cramps. His skin was acting up as well. Izuku always had clear, moisturized skin. Now, however, it was dry and peeling, a constant itch just under the surface that distracted him often. His body temperature was completely messed up. It was like he couldn't get comfortable. Either everything was freezing and he had to wrap himself in every warm thing he owned, or it felt like he was on fire, dripping sweat and his skin literally burning hot to anyone else. He wondered if this was how Todoroki felt when first learning to regulate his quirks, or maybe it was just weird puberty kicking Izuku's ass once more. After the long week of odd stress his body placed him under, it was an extreme relief to eat his mother's food, which again seemed to fill him with that odd childhood vulnerability more and more with each bite. The moment he'd stepped foot into his mother's house, the woman had been fussing over him. "Oh Izuku baby, you look so tired sweetie. Here, have a cup of tea and sit down. I made cookies and dinner is just starting. I know how hungry my baby boy can get. Just rest while mommy takes care of you, okay?" Yes, his mother's babying was odd, but it was something he was used to. And honestly, sometimes it was just a relief to have someone care so much about him, even if it was at times rather smothering. The tea was perfect as always, and the cookies were fresh and gooey. It only took a few moments for the effects to sink in and that familiar feeling entering his veins. Usually it was a softer sort of feeling. I guess he must just have really been missing his mom. Brains can be strange. He let himself sink into the couch and rested his eyes. He felt oddly dizzy. Not too bad. He was probably just dehydrated. He always forgot to drink water at school. He stood up from the couch and walked over to grab a glass of water. The moment he reached the kitchen, his mother jumped up with a squeak. She leaned over a cutting board, chopping something strange Izuku didn't recognize. She covered it up quickly and ran forwards to meet her son with worried eyes. "Izuku baby, I thought I told you to rest while I take care of dinner," she reprimanded. The light scolding made Izuku flush. Not just flush, some of that intense heat came out of his nose as well, like he'd eaten some of Kachan's spicy tofu. "Sorry mama, I was just going to grab some water," he defended, gesturing to the cabinet he was about to reach into. No Zuku, I'll take care of it. Go sit," she demanded, almost shoving him out of the kitchen. Reluctantly, the teen sat back onto the couch and waited as he heard the woman fussing around the kitchen. Minutes later, she came out with a large glass lemonade topped off with half a dozen ice cubes. Izuku felt his eyes well with tears and the sudden gesture. "Oh mom, you didn't have to go all out like that. I could have just had water," he sputtered, arms waving dramatically. "Nonsense." She waved his worries off and gave him a syrupy sweet smile. "I love taking care of my baby boy." She gave him the glass and watched expectantly as he took a sip. It was acidic and sweet. Absolutely delicious, just like everything his mom made was. She smiled at her son and ran back towards the kitchen after smoothing down her apron. As much as Izuku wanted to savor the drink, his thirst took over and he finished it in a matter of sips. The last sip was strange, almost chalky, odd. Maybe their dishwasher was acting up again. It hadn't been cleaning dishes properly since 3rd grade when Kachan accidentally blasted the control panel with his quirk. The memory came to Izuku with a comfortable sort of sweetness. It was just like he said. His mother's food took him back to his childhood in ways he couldn't explain. Dinner was ready soon after and Izuku was led to the table decorated with his favorite meal, katsudon. His bowl was already made and sitting in front of his usual spot. He nearly stumbled into his seat and immediately began to wolf down his favorite dish. He paused after a couple bites and let his eyes shut, just savoring the moment. At home he felt vulnerable and open, like his mom could pry into any secret or idea Izuku may have and see right through it, usually finding some way to coddle him with it. He loved his mom so very much that sort of smothering was at this point more a comfort to him than something novel. She always treated her little boy with the utmost care. Izuku hadn't realized how odd it would feel after getting used to Yue. At home he was coddled and wrapped in a bubble. He was Inko's baby boy. He wasn't strong or all that smart, but she loved him anyways. Yue was so different. He was respected as an ally, as an opponent, as a friend. Sometimes he forgot that he wasn't that quirkless kid anymore, that he was so much more than that. It seemed his mother sometimes forgot as well. No matter how much strength he showed, he would always be his mother's baby boy and always needed to be protected in her eyes. A mother's love was strong, he supposed, and if something seemed horribly wrong in his brain at that thought, the teen ignored it in favor of the meal he was currently enjoying. Yes, Izuku very much loved his mom, and she loved him too. A whole lot, so much so it was stifling. But that was how it was supposed to be. She just wanted to protect him, to keep him safe. It was only natural after all. Wow, he was dizzy. Fuck, and why was his mouth so dry? He reached for oolong tea on his placemat and took a long sip, only to find that chalky aftertaste in his mouth again. He tried to stand, but his legs felt numb, his knees all wobbly as he tried to take to his feet. His mom was now grabbing his arm, supporting him, always a constant support. She was saying something. He couldn't quite make out the words. Everything was blurry and the world seemed to spin. Her nails began to dig into his skin, grounding him a bit more in reality. Mom, don't worry, sweetie, I'll take care of you, okay? I always will. Her voice faded out again and Izuku began to panic. Why wasn't she more concerned? He could barely stand. He needed help. Why was she still muttering? No, Yue. He managed to stutter out. His lips felt like lead. His mouth felt stuffed with cotton. No, Izuku. Her voice was harsher now, anger slipping through her bubbly demeanor. I'm taking care of you. You need me, Zuku, not that school. Come on now, baby, let's get you settled for a nap. Her grip on his arm tightened and he felt his weary body get dragged further into the apartment. He had half the mind to protest at the action before he was pushed onto the couch and heavily tucked in by blankets. Half of him wanted to just give in, to relax and let his mom take care of her helpless little Izuku. The other half was screaming at him, shouting, no, I'm not helpless, Mom, I have a quirk now. I'm a hero. I'm a hero. I'm a poor baby boy. It must be so hard without mommy there to help you. She was muttering, fussing over how tightly tucked the blankets were. He opened his mouth to respond but was quickly stopped. Her finger was pressed to his lips and she was making shushing noises now. Everything was so blurry he could barely even make out her face. He couldn't stop the slight whimper that left his lips. Kami, he felt so helpless. SHH baby, just relax for me. Be my good little Izuku, okay? The familiar nickname was overshadowed by the now sickly sweet tone her voice had adapted. It was like she was speaking to a baby, not her 15-year-old son. Her 15-year-old, hero student son, with a quirk as strong as All Might's and a mind quick enough to keep ahead of his classmates. Panic overtook the teen. He felt vulnerable and scared, like someone had sliced through his abdomen and exposed his organs to be seen by the world. That gentle prying that his mother used was pushed further until it was ripping his modesty away from him. It wasn't sleep that took the teen. Sleep was peaceful, the body's rest. This was a forced shutdown, a sort of overload. His vision grayed out and his breathing slowed until it was barely a crawl. He'd never felt so dizzy. It was as if everything was spinning in all directions. He felt so fragile, so broken like this. His body's only reaction was to open his mouth and let his tongue loll out as words failed to form. There was no sleep. It was just his body trapped in a sort of lucid dream, the world tumbling and turning and graying out while his body could do nothing to respond. At some point, his mother left his side. He wasn't sure whether he was more relieved or terrified at that thought. He had no idea how long he remained in that position, barely enough control to even blink his eyelids. There was a soft buzzing emanating from his side. His phone. Someone was calling him, repeatedly. He couldn't have forced his body to move, so he just sat there, feeling the phone buzz in frequent intervals, faintly remembering the rule Aizawa-sensei had set to check in every hour either over text or with his communicator. It was a new system, a simple necklace Yaoyorozu and Hatsum had created that hung around Izuku's neck. His classmates all had it on their person in some way. Jiru wore it as an ear piercing and Shoji had it attached to the clip of his mask. Kacchan begrudgingly wore it as a bracelet along with several other classmates, while Kaminari had it modified to replace his regular tongue piercing. It was a basic sort of communicator with a tracker built in that the teachers had access to at all times. Since Kacchan's kidnapping, it seemed like the best way for Aizawa-sensei to keep track of his problem class. There was enough willpower left in his head to push his hand out of the tucked-in blanket. He groped his own neck and chest, trying to find the small circular piece hanging around his neck. He found it and almost whimpered again at how sensitive he felt and how cold the air seemed as it touched his exposed neck. He pressed the button held in his stiff hand, but after that, he had no strength left. There was no more willpower available and he felt his mind go sluggish and slow. His eyes shut within the next few moments, his heartbeat gradually growing slower and slower and slower. And when his heart gave way was the exact moment a knock on the door echoed through the apartment. Shouta was concerned, extremely concerned. Whenever one of his students had permission to go off of campus, he was always on edge. Nimari liked to joke that he was like a mother hen for his students, too overprotective, too untrusting. She clearly hadn't met a single one of the problem children because if she had, she would know that none of them could be trusted to make dinner, let alone go out alone. Despite these feelings, he had allowed Midoriya the evening with his mother. He saw the toll the dorms were having on the kid. He was more on edge and seemed to be lacking sleep and a proper comfort zone. The kid looked to be in constant discomfort, and Shouta could have sworn he'd heard the kid growl at another student. If he was taking after Bakugo, then they were all doomed. So when the overly emotional boy had brought the consent form to Shouta, asking to have dinner with his mom this Friday, hands shaking and lip quivering, Shouta couldn't bring himself to say no. Besides, he was meant to be back at the dorms by 8 and check in with Shouta every hour until then. There was no room for misdoings, and so far the boy had been diligent in keeping Shouta updated on his previous outing. Those, however, had been with the company of at least one of his classmates. Alone, Shouta was concerned that Midoriya wouldn't be able to avoid trouble. There was a reason he called him problem child after all. It had been an hour and a half since Midoriya's last text. He tried to give the kid the benefit of the doubt. He knew that he was paranoid and that teens were prone to forgetting. That fact unfortunately did not ease his anxiety. When the kid got back, he'd give him a warning and maybe an extra exercise to really drive the point home. But there was a tug in his gut that told him something was wrong. That planted the question of if the boy would be coming back at all. That tug only strengthened when he got an alert from Midoriya's communicator. The communicators were a new installment, both a test for Hatsum and a failsafe for when his class inevitably got in trouble. They had a recording piece that, when pressed, would record the audio of the next 10 seconds, enough to get out any important information but not too long as to hinder speed of transfer. It really was a brilliant invention. Using her quirk, Hatsum was able to work the circuit into such a small scale that the device itself was no larger than a penny. Easily concealed and marvelously practical. When he listened to the recording sent from Midoriya's communicator, he heard nothing. He leaned closer to his speaker and turned the volume up to max. Well, it wasn't complete silence. The device had a wide range, so it was able to pick up the slightest sounds and sounds in a decent distance surrounding the device. He could hear breathing and the rustling of cloth and what sounded like plates clicking against each other. 7 seconds and a soft whimper took over the recording, and Shouta immediately recognized it as his student. He jumped out of his chair and slammed his laptop shut before pulling up the tracking app on his phone. Again, an ingenious system created thanks to Hatsum. Midoriya was hurt, and it must have been bad if he couldn't send more than a whimper. That was saying something, since the kid had a pain tolerance that was frankly terrifying. He wasn't one to complain and rarely made any sort of indication of the pain he was in. For the boy to whimper, fuck, he needed to go. And now, the boy's communicator was still at his mother's apartment. He could tell that from the app. His location had remained the same for the past hour and a half according to the app's records. It wasn't far, only a 15-minute walk from UA. Still, a part of the hero's mind was already splitting. What if he wasn't fast enough? What if Midoriya was kidnapped? Why hadn't he left the moment Midoriya was late to check in? What if? No, he couldn't spiral, he had to focus. He was already out of the teacher's dorms and fully decked out in his hero gear by the time his mind had sharpened. He was now at UAS gates, which were closed tightly. He scanned his pass and a red light flicked on. Hello, Aizawa-kun. Where are you going at this time of night? You don't have patrol according to your schedule. It was Principal Nenzu's voice. It echoed through the tinny speaker about the place he scanned his pass. Despite the principal's wondering, the gates still began to open. Midoriya hasn't responded. I'm going to check on him. Oh well, I do hope the young boy is alright. Would you like me to contact the police, Aizawa-kun? The hero pondered that for a moment, but the tugging in his gut increased and his face stretched into a grimace. I have a bad feeling about this. If my gut is wrong, at least that should knock some sense into Midoriya. Either way, the police would be useful. With that, the hero took off without another word, satisfied that the rat had understood and trusted Shouta's gut. The hero quickly began running. On the ground he was fast, his stamina was top tier and he was light on his feet, but it didn't feel fast enough. By the time he'd made his way to a more residential area, it had already been 2 minutes. 2 minutes too long if he was to continue trusting his gut. He couldn't help but think back to the last time he had a feeling as bad as this, surrounded by forest and seeing smoke rise above the trees in the distance, smelling an oddly sweet odor, leaving most of his students with the wild pussycats, heroes he trusted, while he and Vlad continued with the extra lesson. That painful tug when he heard the first scream ring from the trees and finding problem child bruised, broken, and battered but still going. Gotta keep moving, faster. He threw out a loop of his capture scarf and used it to propel himself onto a nearby roof. He quickened his pace, this time roof hopping and using his capture scarf to propel him at higher speeds. This way he could skip the winding alleys this area of the city had, as well as get a more bird's eye perspective on the situation. Not for the first time, Shouta found himself wishing he'd had a quirk like Hawk's. If he had, he would have been there by now. Midoriya would already be safe. If only he could have been faster, then maybe he could have gotten him out of the way. Maybe he wouldn't have seen his limp body between bits of rubble covered in blood. Focus. He cut himself off. 5 minutes now and he caught a glimpse of the apartment complex Midoriya lived in. He'd never actually been inside, as he'd left Yagi to speak with the Midoriyas regarding dorms. But he remembered the exterior well enough to recognize it in the dimming light. The tracker certainly helped to fulfill his assumption as it began to beep the closer he was to the teen's location. A final swing had him flying over the street and onto the street lamp on the other side. Gripping it tightly, he slid down the lamp like a fire pole and ran towards the teen's apartment. 209.209.209. Second floor. The kid's apartment building lacked any sort of main foyer. Stairs led directly to each apartment door from the outside, upper floors being supported on decks that wrapped around a quarter of the building. He bolted up the steps, nearly flying over the last few with the momentum he'd created with his capture scarf. His pace didn't slow as he ran down the deck, scanning door numbers. Finally, he slid to a harsh stop. His breaths came in heavy pants, sweat dripped down his brow. There was no window by the door he could see through, but a light through the crack indicated there was some kind of life inside. There was no obvious commotion. All also seemed quiet and calm in the apartments around 209. And 209 blended itself perfectly in with others. Nothing appeared to be wrong, so why was his gut still screaming at him to just go? He forced himself to take a shaky breath. Then he smashed his fist against the door in a likely too aggressive knock. It was only a moment before the door was opened. A moment too long, but still only a moment. A short, plump woman with dark green hair and round emerald eyes stood in the open doorway. The resemblance was uncanny. The only thing Midoriya seemed to have inherited from someone else was his freckles and curly hair, as the woman in front of him had stick-straight hair and peaky skin without any beauty marks. She looked at the hero with wide eyes, and for a moment Shouta almost felt guilty for scaring her. Almost. "I'm Aizawa Shouta, your son's homeroom teacher at UA. I'm here to check on him," he said to the woman. It was best to keep this straight and simple without any fuss. He wanted to bring the young Midoriya back as soon as possible. "Oh well, Izuku is fine, sir," she stuttered out. "He's just taking a little nap right now," Inko Midoriya replied, gesturing inside to the couch where the teen seemed to be sprawled out on. The hero almost let out a relieved sigh, prepared to lecture the boy, then take him back to the dorms by the scruff of his neck if necessary. But his sigh caught in his throat as he looked at the boy, taking in his features. He watched how unusually relaxed the boy's body was, how devoid of tension, and worst of all, how pale and dead he looked. His face was devoid of any expression. His tongue lolled out of his mouth and was turning a sickening purple hue. He almost choked on his own fear. He had half the mind to press his own emergency communicator as he sprinted, shoving Inko out of the way and grabbing the kid off of his own couch. The woman began to yell and protest, but Shouta ignored her completely. There was no response. His head snapped back at the movement, and Shouta laid the kid as gently as he could onto the ground. He pressed an ear to the boy's chest. If he was breathing, then it was too faint to hear. He reached around the boy's neck, pushing soft green curls out of the way, seeking out his pulse. Nothing. Then he began CPR. 30 compressions, then 2 puffs of air into the boy. Then repeat, again and again and again and again. Suddenly someone was trying to pull him away. He shoved them away, not letting a single thought drift away from the child beneath him, whose hair kept flickering from green to wispy blue in the hero's eyes. He felt ribs give way under him. He felt the cracking and snapping as he pushed and pushed and pushed. He didn't know how long he did that. It could have been mere minutes or it could have been hours. It didn't matter how long he did it, he just needed to save the kid. He needed to save Midoriya. He needed to save Izuku. Needed to save his friend. He heard yelling around him. He faintly saw flashing lights. Someone tried to push him away again, but he didn't allow it. He wouldn't let go, and all the while he didn't stop. Later he would realize that the police must have showed up, ambulance in tow. They attempted to replace the hero with a paramedic but were vehemently refused and shoved away. A stretcher was slid under the young Midoriya, and they were both carried to the ambulance, Shouta performing CPR the entire time. How he hadn't been conscious of the movement he didn't know. But it wasn't until he was literally forced off of Izuku that he realized his environment had changed from the teen's apartment to an ambulance. He tried to scramble back towards the teen, but was held back by someone much stronger than he was. Actually, it must have been multiple someones because he distinctly felt more than one pair of hands restraining him. He watched as a nurse prepped a defibrillator. Clear. When called out, they pressed the electricity into the boy's chest, His body jolted and stuttered, but remained limp. 1, 2, 3 clear. The process was repeated again. And again, the boy's body jolted with the shock, this time staying tense for longer. Then his form dropped once more. Shouta wasn't breathing. Turn up the intensity. Clear. The machine was pressed onto the boy's chest again. This time, instead of just jolting, the electricity seemed to lick across the boy's skin, rippling and flickering like when he used full cowling. A shock went through the teen's body, starting at his feet and rolling right up to his head. The teen's whole frame tensed and stuttered. Position held for a moment even after the defibrillator was removed. Hua. The boy inhaled violently, eyes flashing open as he gasped for air. Something squeezed out of Shouta's eyes, hot and wet and painfully forced out of his unused tear ducts. Izuku tried to sit up but sobbed in pain as he continued to gasp for breath. One of the nurses began to put away the machine while another pushed the boy back into the bed. A third nurse stuck a needle in the teen's arm and began to set up an IV while a fourth was touching Izuku's head. He was sliding his fingertips along his face, tracing the curves and allowing his hands to dip lower, continuing to trace invisible lines. He tilted Izuku's head to the side, then lifted his hands away for a moment. Before placing them along the boy's stomach, he traced them upwards in strange fluid motions. Then he flicked his finger and Izuku began to gag. A bag was held in front of his mouth as the boy retched and puked his guts out, all the while tears streaming down his face in fat globules that stuck to his eyelashes and slipped off of his nose as he continued to puke. It was a wrecked sound as each gag was intercepted by sobs, and without time to breathe he was trying to gasp in between retches. Finally, the gagging eased. The puking had stopped. There were a few more violent and raw coughs before the bag was pulled away and taken by one of the nurses to an unknown location. The fourth nurse from before had taken position again at Izuku's head, tracing the invisible lines over his face and down to his chest. His hands pulled away, seemingly satisfied with whatever he had done. Izuku fully collapsed onto the bed, head in the same position that the nurse had left it in. Izuku was a mess. Puke stained the sides of his mouth and tears streamed down from his eyes while snot leaked out of his nose. He was shirtless as someone had cut it away when the defibrillator was brought out, and the boy was shivering violently. Shouta watched his chest move with each breath he took, staying at the place where his heart was almost like if he stared hard enough he could will it so that it kept on beating. The teen was an absolute wreck, but he was alive. He was alive and breathing and crying, and now he was looking at Shouta, his eyes as wide as saucers. Shouta stared back. Izuku was alive. He was okay. He hadn't realized he was still being held back until the hands released. He stood up and stumbled towards the teen before kneeling down right next to him. In a moment of weakness, he reached up and grabbed Izuku's hand. It was cold and clammy and almost dead before Izuku squeezed his hand back weakly. Someone knelt down beside him, closer to Izuku's head, but the Erasure hero couldn't care less. His kid was alive and he just needed to make sure he stayed alive. A long skeletal-looking hand reached towards the teen's face holding a damp towel. As one of the man's hands came up to cup the teen's cheek, the other began to shakily clean off his face, wiping away puke, tears, and snot, cleaning the boy's face with such gentle care that caused the boy to only cry more. The boy opened his mouth but was quickly hushed. Shouta recognized that these hands must have been some of the ones holding him back. "It's all right, my boy." The voice of the man calmed as he continued to swipe the towel across the teen's face. Shouta looked over at the familiar voice to see none other than Yagi Tashinori, All Might, gently cleaning off his student's face as if he were the most precious thing in the world. The man's own expression was soft, more vulnerable than Shouta had ever seen it as he wiped another tear from Izuku's face. "Don't worry, my boy, I am here." And despite hearing that phrase so many times from the #1 hero, this time was far different. He didn't sound confident, and it wasn't said loudly as to show the world. No, it was said directly to Izuku, a gentle reassurance, a common line altered to provide the comfort it needed. And it did provide the necessary comfort. As with those words, Izuku breathed deeply a few more times, eyes flashing between both of his teachers as he squeezed Shouta's hand. Then he shut his eyes and his body relaxed, all except for the hand holding Shouta's, which was still held tight. The hero felt his breaths begin to quicken and took the moment to check the boy's pulse from his wrist. He sighed in relief as this time he could feel it as strongly as ever. The teen's heart was beating with the strength it should have had this entire night. The ambulance was quiet save for the shuffling of the paramedics and the beeping of equipment. "Aizawa-kun, not now," Shouta interrupted Yagi. He took a shaky breath and let himself calm as the growing warmth of Izuku's hand reassured him. "At the hospital, just not now." The man seemed to understand as he didn't press any further. He simply reached over and began to pet softly at Izuku's head, his green curls bouncing back up after each pet. Shouta exhaled deeply again. Then he inhaled, then let it out again. Izuku was alive. He was safe. Shouta had gotten there in time. He had been fast enough, if only just barely. he mumbled, mostly to himself but loud enough so Yagi was able to hear. Kami, what the fuck just happened? Yagi seemed to sense that this was not a question he was meant to respond to. And so both the heroes sat and pondered quietly. What the fuck just happened? The rest of the ambulance ride went by as a blur. Izuku was passed out, hand still clutching Shouta's. At some point one of the nurses had laid a blanket over the teen. It was more like a thin, flimsy sheet, but it was at least enough to allow the kid some dignity and a minute amount of warmth. There were 8 people inside the ambulance, including the sleeping teen and the 4 nurses. That left Shouta, Yagi, and Detective Tsukachi, who was responsible for the other set of hands that were previously holding the Erasure hero back. Despite Shouta's protests at Yagi's questioning, the detective pressed onwards with his own notebook in hand and a pensive expression on his face. They both went through the familiar motions of questioning. Tsukachi asked basic questions first. When was the last message he received from Midoriya? What was the set curfew and agreement before the teen had left UA? He used his own device to record the conversation and asked Shouta to play the recording sent by Midoriya's own communicator. Shouta relayed what information he had. He described his journey to Midoriya's home and the bad feeling in his gut. He described the brief interaction with Midoriya's mother before he had seen the boy himself. Then he relayed what the boy's condition had been and what his immediate reaction was. The detective took his words in stride, nodding along until Shouta's story was finished. When he was done with Shouta, he asked to speak with the nurse who was previously touching Midoriya. The man's quirk was called affliction. By tracing the body's major veins and arteries, he was able to determine what it was currently being afflicted with, and in certain situations he was able to force the removal of the substance afflicting the victim. He stated that the teen had gone into cardiac arrest but was able to be brought back by CPR and use of a defibrillator. The cause of the issue was determined to be a drug overdose taken orally. Shouta's heart shattered and he squeezed the kid's hand with renewed vigor. Yagi seemed to take the news just as well. He was gently petting Midoriya's head and staring at the boy with a look of heartbreak on his face. We aren't sure what the drug was that caused the cardiac arrest. However, it seems the effects may have been negated once it was removed from his system. We'll test the contents of his stomach in the lab at the hospital. If you could send some of it to the police's lab as well, that would be appreciated. We aren't sure if there was any kind of foul play here or if this was ... or self-inflicted. You could cut the tension in the room with a knife. No, Naomasa. Young Midoriya would never do something like that. Yagi protested, jumping up from where he was seated. Yagi, sit down. We won't know anything for sure until we can talk to the kid, Shouta stated. Despite how much it hurt to think Midoriya had done this to himself, it was a possibility that couldn't be ignored, both for his safety and everyone else's. It was odd though. Midoriya, while sometimes self-sacrificing, didn't seem like the type to do this. He was overall a happy kid. He wanted to be a hero, to help people. He would rather eat his own hand than inconvenience anyone, and fought every day to be better, to be stronger. To try to commit suicide, especially without any sort of note, is something he couldn't imagine from the teen. Eraserhead is right, Toshinori. Tsukachi agreed. Yagi visibly staggered at this statement. However, that isn't the only option. I have men searching his apartment right now, and I'm planning on interrogating Mrs. Midoriya herself after I get the kid's statement. If I may interject, the nurse stepped forwards. Before anyone is to question Mr. Midoriya, we will be doing some tests to make sure there are no adverse side effects, and we will be wrapping and tending to his broken ribs, the nurse said, leaving no room for argument. Shouta grimaced slightly at the nurse's reminder of the harsh CPR he had been using on his student earlier. He could vividly remember the feeling of ribs cracking and snapping as he tried to bring his student back to life. He was alive though. That's all that mattered. His ribs would heal. Of course, Yagi questioned. Byaosu nai. Ah yes, Byaosu-san. Thank you. The former number 1 hero bowed, showing his gratitude to the man before him. He then sat back down by Midoriya as the ambulance lapsed into quiet once more. They were now pulling up to the hospital. Midoriya was carried on the stretcher out of the ambulance and towards the pediatric floor of the hospital. Shouta and Yagi were blessedly allowed to follow as they were both pro-heroes and also the boy's current legal guardians thanks to his residence in the dorms of UA. He was awake now, though still obviously groggy. The boy was yet to say anything, and it only caused his teachers to grow more anxious with his silence. Midoriya had an odd look on his face. His eyebrows were pinched together and his gaze was pointed downwards. He barely reacted as the nurses went about their tests and began to wrap and treat his injured ribs. The kid remained deep in thought, imaginary gears turning within his mind. Suddenly, the teen's face twisted in disgust. He reached a hand up to his mouth as his jaw was wiggling around and adjusting itself. Young Midoriya, my boy, what is it? Yagi asked, far too loudly for the hospital late-night environment. My teeth. He had an intense lisp that confused the room. His mouth was moving around trying to adjust itself around words that seemed now unfamiliar. Open your mouth for me, lad. A nurse commanded as she approached the boy with a couple of tools. The teen complied, opening his mouth wide for the nurse. She began to hum to herself as she maneuvered her tools in the boy's mouth while shining a light inside. Odd. Your gums are extremely inflamed, especially around your canines, and your tongue appears to be enlarged, or rather elongated. Does your quirk have any sort of mutation factor? The boy shook his head in response. Strange. Could you stick your tongue out for me, please? He did as she said, and even Shouta couldn't contain his shock at what he saw. Izuku's tongue stuck out far further than what was normal, like a significant amount further. There were odd bumps along the whole thing, and weirdest of all, the end appeared to be forked and lizard-like. Well, lad, it appears you are beginning to develop some late mutations from your quirk. If I were to hazard a guess, I would assume the reason your gums are inflamed is because a new set of teeth are trying to come through. Nothing to be worried about. It's all a natural part of quirk growth. That shouldn't be possible, Shouta interjected. Midoriya's quirk isn't any kind of mutation, it's not even related. He has a strength quirk. Nothing that should cause any mutations. It wasn't entirely unheard of for quirks to develop new features, but a mutation feature in superpower. That made no sense. HRMM, the nurse hummed, her own eyebrows pinching together. Izuku had closed his mouth by now, his tongue slithering back in with a strange flicking motion that seemed unfamiliar to even the teen. If anything, his questioning look was even stronger now. He was avoiding eye contact with both of his teachers and deemed instead to stare at his lap. I'd like to draw some blood to do a couple of tests. Midoriya nodded in response, and Shouta gestured as well before slumping in his seat. Do whatever you need to, he responded, giving his consent. Midoriya, could you please try to explain yours and your parents' quirks to me while I do? She asked as she began to set up the blood-drawing equipment. The boy shared a quick, almost panicking look with Yagi, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod in response. Well, my mom can whacked it way attract small objects towards herself. And my dad can breathe no. It's okay, kid, take your time. Shouta tried to reassure, seeing the kid's frustration with his new lisp. He took a breath before continuing, my dad can breathe fire. I think that's all, but I haven't met him, so I don't know much else. The boy said, finally wrapping his new tongue around the TH sound. And my quirk is called superpower. It gives me strength L like All Might's, but I can't handle it all, so at full power it makes my bones break. The nurse hummed in response again, a soothing sound that had Shouta unwillingly relax in his own chair. Well, it's possible your father's quirk was slightly different than you were told, or more complicated. You may be gaining these mutations from him. It's odd timing, but with quirks anything can be possible, lad? The nurse asked, as she pulled the needle out of the boy's arm and stood up with the blood. Why, yeah, the teen responded. Despite his words, he looked far more dejected at the idea than one would have expected. For now, you should rest. The results won't be in for at least a few hours. I understand that you both would like to stay with Midoriya, but please allow yourselves some rest as well. She all but commanded, making eye contact with both Yagi and Shouta. They both gave her a curt nod, and she smiled slightly before leaving the three of them to their room. The first thing Tsukachi's detectives found in their search was a special container on Inko's counter labeled Izuku's dinner. It had the leftover food she must have cooked that night for Izuku. The piece that made that strange was that there was another container with the exact same food inside labeled My Food. The separate containers seemed suspicious, so they took both into the station for testing. Next, his men searched the bathroom in Izuku's bedroom. The bathroom had nothing odd, only normal pain medication and some anti-anxiety meds with Inko's name on them. Izuku's room was also clean. It was mostly empty save for a few childish decorations. The second strange thing the detective found was in Inko's bedroom. Under her bed, there was a box filled with strange metal bracelets. The box was labeled out of power, and the bracelets were taken to the station. Also under the bed was a large black duffel bag. In said bag was an iPhone, and strangest of all, massive bags filled with various colored powders of various quantities. Each bag was labeled in a specific order. One was test batch 1 and another marker. The words 2 week were drawn onto the bag. This similar naming scheme was used for the various other bags, of which there were 13 total. In the kitchen, the detectives found another bag labeled test batch 14 tucked under the cutting board in one of the drawers. This bag was mostly empty. All the bags were taken in for testing. The phone was fully charged and had an untraceable SIM card. Since the password was unknown, it would take a bit to get into the phone. However, without the code itself, they were still able to see the recently unseen notifications. They were from a number saved as Kai and were inquiring how the latest batch had worked and if she needed any more of the suppressant. Needless to say, the evidence didn't paint a pretty picture. While the substance in these bags was still unknown, it could be heavily assumed that Inko had drugged her son's dinner and may have been testing unknown drugs on her son for an extended period of time. Tsukachi was beyond angry. He was furious and he was concerned. It was unknown how long this had been happening or even what drugs were used. Inko Midoriya must have gone too far with the dosage this time. possibly because she hadn't been able to give her son a consistent dose since he had come to the dorms. She'd gotten sloppy, and with that sloppiness she risked her son's life. No, she didn't risk it. She killed him and he had to be brought back. While nothing was completely certain yet, with all the incriminating evidence it was almost impossible to assume anything else. He would wait for the results, keep Inko in custody until things were more clear and charges could actually be pressed. For now, he needed to get Izuku's statement without revealing the situation. He needed to know what the boy knew. He gave the teen about an hour to get settled and set up in his hospital room. Toshinori and Aizawa waited with him, keeping a close eye on the teen. Tsukachi had never seen the Erasure hero so devastated as to when he had arrived at the Midoriya apartment. He hadn't been aware enough to recognize himself or Toshinori even as they dragged the hero off of Izuku so the paramedics could do their work. The two had arrived together as they were discussing the League of Villains when Tsukachi got Netsu's message. At the idea of his successor being in danger, Toshinori demanded he be taken along. At most they had worried the boy had been attacked in his home, that he was in the middle of a villain fight. Neither man expected to see the boy dead and engaged in CPR by his homeroom teacher. It had horrified them both beyond compare. Even just thinking back on the previous hour had the detective feeling sick to his stomach, especially with the new information he had acquired. He was being led to Izuku's room by a nurse who was informing him on the boy's condition and the new development that was presenting itself within the boy's mouth. While it was concerning and further enhanced the bad feeling in his gut, the boy was mostly alright and would make a full recovery within the next week. It was a reassurance that Tsukachi was deeply grateful for. The teen's room was basic, but private. It was a solo room on the 3rd floor with a small square window that led out into the street. Izuku was sitting up in bed drinking water from a straw while Toshinori and Aizawa were sitting in chairs on either side of the boy. Aizawa seemed to have been feigning a nap before the door opened while Toshinori had simply closed the book he had been glimpsing through. Hello Midoriya, he felt sick even saying that name, but this was not the time to be casual. I'm Detective Tsukachi and I'd like to ask you a few questions if that's alright. Why yeah, of course sir. You're the detective in charge of the LOV case, right? The teen answered. His voice was slightly scratchy but otherwise he seemed fine. There was a lisp in his voice however that the detective was certain hadn't been there before. Yes I am, he responded and pulled up the third and final chair in the room. He took great care to relax his posture and smiled at the heroes in the room. I'm going to be recording this conversation. Is that all right with you, Midoriya? Why yes, he nodded while speaking. Truth. All right, to start, what is your full name and age? My name is Midoriya Izuku and I am 15 years old. Truth. Good start. Can you tell me what you remember about tonight? The boy's face fell for a moment, before his eyes filled with determination once more. I had gotten to Mom's at around 6:30 p.m. She hugged me and told me to sit down while she got dinner ready. Truth. So I sat down and she brought me tea and some cookies she had just finished baking. I ate quite a few of them and drank the tea and it was all perfect. I was starting to feel kind of dizzy and I thought I was just dehydrated, so I went to go get some water. All true. The lisp seems to be diminishing a bit too. Good. I went to the kitchen and Mom got super surprised. She kind of hid what she was doing and ran over to me saying how I should be resting and stuff. Then she brought some lemonade and it was really good, but it kind of had a weird chalky taste at the bottom. It was still good though. She hid, that's not a good sign. Still all true though. So were you still feeling dizzy at this point? He asked. Izuku seemed to stop and think for a moment. Yes, it was almost getting worse. But then dinner was ready and she made my favorite and it just smelled so good I pretty much stuffed my face, but when I was done I just felt worse. My mouth was really dry and everything tasted kind of chalky. Again, I don't know. I tried to drink more tea but it didn't help and I kind of started to panic. The kid almost looked guilty. Yet everything he said was true. I tried to stand up, but my legs were really wobbly and I had to hold on to Mom. Things start to get fuzzy here. I think I mentioned you and she said something about how she would take care of me. My mouth felt like there was cotton stuffed in it and I was just so dizzy she brought me to the couch and kind of tucked me in real tight and she just kept talking and saying weird stuff. What sort of things, kid? He interrupted. The kid let out a shaky sigh and wiped at his eyes which were beginning to well up with more tears. Like how I was her baby and how I didn't need you and she would take care of her baby boy. Her little Izu. It was weird, she just seemed so wrong and I couldn't move really and I couldn't say anything and then I didn't know what to do. She left me veer and I was just stuck in my own head and I think I pressed my communicator but it was also fuzzy and then it got fuzzier. And then it was just dark and then I was in the ambulance and everything was so loud and sharp and it all hurt. Hey my boy, it's all right, Toshinori reassured as he gripped the teen's hand. Take a breath, problem child, it's been a long night, Aizawa added, placing his own hand on the kid's shoulder. both the heroes trying to ground the boy back in the present. The kid took in a shuddering breath, then winced at how it moved his ribs. He exhaled slowly and opened his eyes to look at the detective. "I have one last question for you, Midoriya. And this one is a bit uncomfortable, but did you knowingly take any drugs tonight?" "No, detective," he interrupted. "The only drugs I've ever willingly taken were pain medication." True and true. Some of the tension in the room immediately eased as the three adults took a collective sigh of relief. Then the tension increased again exponentially at what the teen said next. "It was my mom, wasn't it? She drugged me, didn't she?" He looked up at Tsukachi with wide saucers for eyes, both brimming with tears, and in that moment there was no way he could have lied to the teen in front of him. Professionalism be damned. "Yeah, kid, we think she did." Izuku didn't know what to do. That was pretty much it. Everything was fucked. Everything was wrong. It had only taken one night for his entire life to fall apart. He died. Izuku Midoriya had been legally dead for over 20 minutes before he was revived, and in truth, he still didn't feel all there. His ribs ached. The nurses had done their best to treat them, but there were no quirks on staff that could help, and the best that could be done for now was the wrap all the way around his torso. Ordinarily, he would have brushed it off. He'd been hurt worse after all, been through worse. The idea stopped in its tracks as he recalled that no, in fact, this here was the worst. He had died. Not just broken his arms, not just quirk exhaustion. No, he died. His mom had killed him. His sweet, kind, loving mother had killed him. He had never felt so so dull. He should have been sobbing. He should have been broken, screaming and crying and yelling like Kachin did. He wanted to scream and sob, and worst of all, he wanted his mom. Fuck, he was pathetic. She did this, she hurt him, and yet the only thing he wanted right now was to be wrapped in one of her hugs and just cry. And then she would make him hot cocoa and put on an All Might documentary and it would all be better. But instead he was dull and his emotions were warped. Everything felt tainted, and he spent his waking moments trying to literally wrap his tongue around the situation. That was something else that was new and just wrong. His gums ached and his tongue didn't seem to fit in his mouth like it did before. The toothaches weren't new. He'd been having frequent toothaches his entire life, no matter how well he took care of his teeth. They tended to get worse when he spent time away from home, and his mother attributed them to stress. In fact, a lot of weird things always seemed to happen when he was away from mom. The more he thought about it, the more he remembered odd things from his childhood. Toothaches, dry mouth and dry skin that disappeared after dinner but showed up the next few days. Nails that seemed to grow too fast despite how often he cut and chewed at them. Growth spurts that never came, and a frequent sore throat that seemed to get worse the older he got, yet came in short bursts that never left him truly sick. He remembered the bracelets he used to wear. They were ugly and uncomfortable, but mom said they were a gift from his uncle, so he felt he had to wear them. They were supposed to protect him. That's what she said. He remembered the last time he wore one was his second year of middle school, when Kachin had destroyed it during gym class, and his mother lectured him for hours on how he needed to stay out of the blonde's way, how she needed to make sure her little Izu stayed safe. The longer he thought, the more unnerved and violated he felt, every memory tainted with that strange chalkiness and sickly sweet care. He vaguely registered All Might Yagi-san, his mentor, trying to speak with him, but the words fell on deaf ears. He felt bad for being so out of it, for ignoring All Might, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything about that guilt. Eventually, the hero must have stopped talking because the room was now quiet. The detective had left several hours ago now, and Izuku was left alone with his teachers as the moonlight shone through the window. He met Aizawa's eyes and saw a flash of the grief he'd seen when he'd first awoken, no, not awoken, been revived, because Aizawa was the one who had saved him. The details were fuzzy, but his was the first face Izuku saw when he woke up, and he had never seen the man so broken. His eyes were wild and red, not like when he was using his quirk, like he had been crying. The strength in which he held Izuku's hand grounded him, and the gentle squeezes kept reminding him that only moments before he wasn't able to squeeze back. In short, he never wanted to see his teacher like that again. Now the man was lying on the small visitor's couch. He was curled up slightly and watching the teen with careful, considering eyes. His sensei showed so little emotion in most of his face. Most of the time, his expressions could basically be written off as negligible. His eyes, though, told a whole different story. Izuku wasn't sure if the hero knew how much emotion his eyes displayed, or even if Izuku himself was just proficient at reading them. However, it was a welcome reassurance seeing the man did, in fact, have feelings. Yagi staying behind was less of a shock. His reactions, however, left Izuku reeling in confusion. Izuku was still getting used to calling the hero anything other than All Might, the casual position he held with the hero remaining an odd thing to wrap his head around even after over a year of knowing him. Yet his eyes were so gentle when he'd woken up. He'd never seen that look on his face before. He'd never seen the man do something so soft as to clean Izuku's face, making sure to dry his tears and keep him tethered, as if he were to float away if he didn't. Now the former number 1 was sitting hunched in the chair on Izuku's left. It was a strangely familiar position with how often the boy was hospitalized. However, this time felt far more serious than any other. He felt that this time would forever affect any time in the future because he knew there would be more. He was training to be a hero. Heroes got injured, something he'd try valiantly to explain to his mother on his previous hospital visits, her worries smothering him, scaring him into thinking she would remove him from UA altogether. Yes, the more he thought about his mother, the more worrisome situations kept presenting themselves in his memory, as if serving up evidence of his odd life on a platter for all to see. More than anything else that Izuku had felt tonight, he was tired, both physically and emotionally. He had been completely drained, yet he tried his best to avoid sleep. He didn't want to drift off again, didn't want the world to go cold and black. He didn't want to die, and sleep seemed far too close to death. Aizawa seemed to notice his internal conflict. The hero sat up and walked over to Izuku with sad eyes but an otherwise blank expression. Izuku stared right back. He felt his eyes droop slightly, but he fought against them, fighting to hold eye contact with the hero. He was alive. He needed to show the man that he didn't need to worry any longer. The man sighed and broke eye contact. He slumped down into the chair on the right of Izuku. "Problem child, I won't tell you what to do, but your body needs rest. It needs to recover. Everything else can wait until then." His words sounded loud and clear in the otherwise quiet room. He knew his teacher was right, but "I can't." The teen shuddered, feeling pathetic at the admittance. All Might took the moment to clear his throat, gaining Izuku's attention. "Young Mido, young Izuku." The boy hitched a breath. Yagi leaned over and placed hand on Izuku's shoulder. He paused for a moment, seemingly lost in thought before meeting his successor's eyes. "It is not death, my boy." The words struck a heavy chord deep within the teen. A note of understanding must have hit Aizawa as well. "He's right, kid. Sleep isn't death. It's different." The man echoed Yaga's point. Silence for a moment. Izuku's brain devoid of thought, just floaty fears and frozen limbs. "It's just so cold." He must have said that aloud because he felt as another blanket was draped over him. He looked up and saw Yagi giving him a bright but soft smile. It wasn't just another flimsy hospital sheet. It was a fluffy red, blue, and yellow blanket that the former hero pulled out of his bag. Immediately he began to feel warmer. Then he let out a soft oof as another piece of fabric was thrust at him. He grabbed it and examined the plush black sweater that smelled slightly of coffee and cologne. Looking up, he saw that Aizawa-sensei was now sitting with just a tank top, the bottom half of his costume, and his capture scarf, of course. He gestured at Izuku. "Put it on, it should help." He almost started sobbing on the spot. He put on the sweater and instantly the warmth and scent filled him with calm and contentment. He looked between his two heroes, between his two teachers. The two men showed no sign that they were leaving anytime soon, and at the thought, he relaxed even further. The idea of being alone and cold scared him, but being warm and watched by his two favorite heroes ... that was more than enough. As he cozied up in the warm and let a small sigh escape him, he let his eyelids fall without fear of whether or not they would open again. After the teen fell asleep, the two heroes began to relax when he heard soft snores emanating from the boy. The tension came back almost instantly, however, when a soft knock resounded against the door. The more the detective learned about the Midoriya family, the deeper his worries became. "Tsukachi, the bracelets are like the cuffs we use to subdue criminals," stated Sansa, the cat-quirked officer and one of Tsukachi's most trusted men. You could almost hear the pin drop. "They are quirk suppressant cuffs, sir." Tsukachi felt his body tighten, his breath hitching in his throat. He forced himself to relax and bring the phone back up to his ear. "And the powders?" he asked. "A rudimentary drug, all with the same base. It became more and more refined with each batch. Though we've never seen this exact drug in this form, it seems that this is a powdered form of a powerful quirk suppressant drug that's been circling the underworld." The detective began to pace the length of the room he was in. It was an empty office on the ground floor of the hospital that he'd used several times before. He was alone in the office while he waited to hear back from the precinct or the hospital lab. The precinct called first, and thus explained the phone call he was currently on with Sansa. The cat-quirked officer was overseeing the police precinct's testing of the substances found in Midoriya's home and his stomach, while the hospital was testing the teen's blood and his stomach contents as well. So far, the hospital had been unable to give any information. The precinct, however, was quick with its work and had specialized procedures for events such as these. It certainly helped that the victim in question was a hero student involved with the LOV's attacks and also a person of interest due to his connections with All Might and by association Tsukachi. It was overall quite easy to expedite the process of investigation and, by extension, lab testing. Furthermore, we found traces of the same drug in the contents of Midoriya's stomach and the food labeled as his dinner. This is undoubtedly the drug that was used on Midoriya. Although the detective had already suspected this was the case, it didn't make the news any easier to hear. A parent drugging their child was one thing. A parent using quirk suppressants on their child was another. A parent using a fatal dosage of the drug and causing their child to go into cardiac arrest and almost die was another that even for an experienced detective was difficult to hear, especially when the child in question was the successor of one of his dearest friends. Finally, since this is the largest batch of the drug we've been able to uncover, we were able to test more of its properties. We found that there are large traces of human blood inside the makeup of the drug. Whoever made this is using someone's blood, likely their quirk for the result. Sansa continued, each sentence adding more and more horror to the situation. And the phone, were you able to get any information from the burner? Sansa let out a disgruntled sigh before answering. We still haven't made it into the phone. However, it has received several more messages from the number labeled as Kai. They are continuing to inquire about the drug and are now beginning to worry about Inko's lack of response. They used her name directly. Fuck, sir, what should we do? There is a long pause. To start, we are going to give the phone to someone with a hacking quirk. I know someone at a nearby precinct. While you are doing that, I'm going to make some calls and talk to Eraserhead. He responded, still thinking. Also send a copy of Izuku's and his parents' quirk registration files to me and any other personal or legal information on any of them we have in our system. Yes, sir, I'll inform the team. No, Sansa, the officer made a confused grunt. Keep it to a smaller group. We need to keep information as close-knit as possible at the moment. Of course, sir, Sansa answered after a pause. What's going to happen to the kid now that the suppressants are gone? His quirk was already strong with them. I'm not sure, Sansa, the detective responded, and that was partially true. However, he figured that One for All wasn't the quirk they would have to worry about here. Whatever quirk Inko had been suppressing in her son, he was certain it was not one he had inherited from All Might. Izuku Midoriya had a quirk, and it was only a matter of time before they found out what it was. Quirk suppressants. You have got to be fucking kidding me. But Naomasa, that's impossible. Both of you shut up right now. The heroes obediently listened to the detective, each feeling the stark shiver run down their spine as his usually calm voice raised to interrupt them. After his phone call with Sansa, the detective decided to inform Aizawa and Tashinori on what little information he possessed. It was needless to say that neither hero took it well. Izuku was still asleep in his hospital bed, so the three men conversed in the previously unoccupied office where the detective was set up. It was good they had vacated the room as the rising volume and stress from the three men would have easily disrupted Izuku's slumber. The detective took a deep, calming breath, pinching his brow between his fingers. Tashinori, you and I both know why this situation is less than ideal. Tashinori began to protest. Not now, my friend. Yes, now. He snapped at the former number one. Then he sighed, allowing his tone to soften ever so slightly. Aizawa found the kid, he saved him. I don't know about you, but I can't imagine anyone more trustworthy to tell than his teacher. Tell me what? The room seemed to drop several degrees in temperature at Aizawa's voice, cold and sharp. The Erasure hero turned to face the retired hero, his eyes flashing red indiscriminately. Did you know about this, Yagi? The man in question coughed in surprise, blood spewing out of his mouth. No, Aizawa. I had no clue about young Midoriya, young Izuku's mother. This is just what Naomasa is referring to. It's his quirk, Erasure. I'm talking about his quirk. If Tsukachi had been a more well-rested man, he may have felt some semblance of guilt at the betrayed look Tashinori shot him. Despite this look, the detective continued, the quirk suppressants worked, just not on One for All. That woman was suppressing Izuku's original quirk, he stated. He was fighting hard not to keep his fists clenched as the simmering rage continued to rise within him. What the hell do you mean by original quirk? Aizawa fumed. You had better start explaining right now or I swear you won't live to see the outside of this hospital. The hero threatened the skeletal-looking man. The threat hung heavy in the air, the weight behind his words clinging to the tension and dragging it downwards further. Tsukachi wasn't shocked to see his friend cower under Aizawa's harsh glare. Any less brave man would have run away screaming moments ago. Tashinori faltered for a moment before speaking. Then he sighed and rubbed at his head as if it was beginning to hurt. One for All is my quirk, or rather it was. That quirk now lies in the veins of young Izuku. Aizawa's eye began to twitch erratically and the room dropped another few degrees. Keep talking. Well, I suppose I'd better start from the beginning. Tashinori sighed. One for All is a unique quirk, in that it is able to be passed on from one user to the next. It's the brother quirk of another, which is the ability to take and give away quirks as the user pleases. Many years ago, not long after quirks began appearing, two brothers had these quirks. The older brother was a notorious villain using his power to force the loyalties of thousands. All for one, Aizawa interjected and Tashinori began nodding solemnly. Yes, his younger brother opposed his villainous ways. It was believed that he was quirkless and he was constantly sick and weak. All for One became angry and bitter that his brother would not join him, so in a final desperate attempt for his loyalty or possibly to kill him, All for One forced a stockpiling quirk onto his brother. He paused for a moment and Tsukachi continued where he stopped. that allowed the younger brother's previously dormant quirk to become known. The two quirks merged into one for all and have been passed down in generations since. Each user strengthened the power and handed it off to the next until it was hopefully strong enough to defeat all for one for good. As the detective finished, he could see the gears whirring in Aizawa's head. I am the 8th user of this power. Toshinori started again. I believed that I had defeated all for one 6 years ago. I only found out recently that that was not the case. The room was silent for far too long. Then Tsukachi heard a sharp intake of breath as Aizawa began to speak. So, Izuku is the 9th holder of One for All. A quirk you gave to a child when you knew it came with the baggage of possibly the world's oldest and most dangerous villain attached to it. Were you even thinking about Izuku, Yagi? The blame hung heavy in the air. The very molecules surrounding the homeroom teacher seemed to freeze at the icy glare he shot at Toshinori. Of course I was thinking of him, Toshinori shouted, his voice cracking slightly. All for One killed my mentor and almost every other user before her. He murdered them in cold blood. And my power was fading. I needed a successor. And when I met Midori Izuku, a quirkless little boy with the heart of a hero. Quirkless, I knew that it had to be him. I never would have given it had I known All for One had been alive. I would never have put young Izuku into that position. Yet you did, Aizawa shouted now. He began to pace, breathing heavily and grabbing his own hair in strangled gasps. When he looked up at the two men, the hero looked manic with rage. Fucking hell, is that why he was breaking his bones at the beginning of the year? Why didn't you teach him how to use it if it was your fucking quirk, or even tell me? I'm his teacher. I could have helped. Izuku didn't take to it like I did. And we couldn't tell anyone but a select few for the safety of everyone. Toshinori protested, defending himself and his successor immediately. And he has made tremendous progress since I gave the quirk for the entrance exam, so there is no need to. You gave it on the day of the entrance exam. You fucking buffoon. Does that mean that was his first time ever using his quirk? Yes, I mean, well, I couldn't have given it earlier if I had. There was a chance his limbs would have gone flying off from the power until he had enough muscle mass. Flying off. I cannot believe someone society is supposed to admire could be so absolutely stupid. Both of you shut up, the detective yelled. The argument ceased almost immediately, both men panting like they had just been in a fight. Aizawa's eyes were bloodshot and his hair was frizzy and knotted. Toshinori's skin had a thin sheen of sweat across it and he was clutching at his injury. He watched as a small drop of blood dripped out of the hero's mouth. Aizawa, you can yell at Toshinori later. For now there are more important things to worry about, like what quirk was being suppressed. You could see the dawning realization on the pro and former pro's faces, both more akin to horror than anything else. This prompted the detective to continue his concerned musings. Contrary to what we believed, Izuku Midoriya was not quirkless before he received One for All. His quirk was just being suppressed. We have no idea what it may be and how it may manifest or interact with One for All. He made shaky eye contact with Aizawa as the man's eyebrows furrowed. Shit, it'll be like a kid getting their quirk for the first time except on steroids. Aizawa ran his hands through his hair with a grimace. And whatever quirk it is will have been strengthened by One for All as well, Toshinori added, his face growing more and more pale. Yes, to both of those things, he agreed. Based on what the doctors told him about his tongue and tooth pain, his quirk is going to have some kind of mutation factor, but we don't know how far those mutations will go, especially since his mother's quirk is nothing like it. The unasked question hung in the room, waiting to be grabbed by one of the three men. Toshinori, ever the brave one, was the man to grab onto it. My boy did mention that his father had a fire-breathing quirk. But as far as I know, he's never met the man, and his mother told me he lives in America. All of that could be lies as well, considering what we know about Inko. Aizawa cut in. Clearly she never wanted Midori Izuku to develop a quirk in the first place. It's possible she didn't want anything tying the kid to his father. It's also possible that she was trying to hide Izuku's existence. If it's a showy mutation quirk that was starting to develop, it's likely the similarities to his father will be stark. That was exactly what I was worried about, Aizawa. He cut the hero off as he began to mutter. However, I've been looking through our records of his father, Hisashi Midoriya, and the man doesn't seem to exist. He's not on the kid's birth certificate, and the only mention of him or his quirk are from Izuku's files. So Izuku's father is some sort of villain that was able to hide all traces of his existence. Maybe someone Inko was hiding from, Aizawa concluded. Or the identity we have is completely incorrect and his father doesn't even know he exists. Toshinori continued where the hero paused. The only way to know for certain is to talk to Inko. Tsukachi interrupted. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She's currently being held at the station. If we want any answers, we are going to need to talk to her first and foremost. Both the heroes nodded in agreement, a silent camaraderie forming between them. Hopefully she'll be willing to talk before Izuku shows any more signs of his quirk. If she isn't talking to you, I wouldn't mind taking a crack at the questioning. I'm a tad rusty, but I've been told I can be very persuasive, Aizawa offered. A joyless smirk crossed his features, more a show of teeth than a real smile. Kashinori looked momentarily scandalized. Then his face dropped to something more dismissed. As much as I despise the use of such violent tactics, I loathe the idea of what that woman kept from my boy even more. I wouldn't mind bending a few rules myself, he admitted to the two men. The looming threat of violence filled the air again. This time, however, it was all targeted at the same source. The opening of the office door was both a shock and a breath of fresh air to Shouta. It wasn't that he despised the company he was with. It was that the tension had become unbearable and the steel grip he held on his emotions was beginning to falter. He wasn't an emotional man. He prided himself on his willpower. Yet tonight was far too much for him and his dry, aching eyes. The nurse had a pensive look on her face as she entered the office. She was holding a clipboard that had several official hospital forms stuck to it. My apologies for the interruption, sirs. However, I must discuss the results of Izuku's blood test with the boy's legal guardian, she asked, her eyes darting between the three of them. With a sigh, Shouta stepped forwards. For now, that would be me. I'm his homeroom teacher and current legal guardian at UA. What did you find? The nurse nodded and stepped further into the room, closing the door behind her. Majority of the results are well within the regular range. Shouta heard a sigh of relief escape Yagi. Excluding tonight, the boy is extremely healthy with no obvious underlying issues. However, she paused and the tension increased tenfold. His blood does appear to have some clotting properties that are commonly seen in cold-blooded mutation quirks. Shouta couldn't help the confusion that must have been showing on his face. Currently, his body is struggling to regulate its temperature, and we found that he needs to run at much higher heats than what is usually considered average. In short, he's way too cold. We gave him some extra blankets and raised the heat in his room until his full mutations come in or he is able to self-regulate again. His temperature needs to be kept an eye on. Shouta forced his face back to its usually bored expression as the nurse finished. Tsukachi stepped up beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Is there anything else you can tell us about the boy's quirk? The detective asked. At this moment, there isn't much else we know. Frustrating, but unsurprising. His past medical files are old and formatted sloppily. It's obvious to us that his previous quirkless diagnosis was forged as we found no vestigial traits on his body except for the second toe joint. Usually, a quirkless individual would also have an appendix or gallbladder. Without one of these vestigial organs, any real doctor would have lost their license if they diagnosed him as quirkless. Ah, lovely. More reason to despise Izuku's mother. Falsifying quirk documents is a hefty crime. Her list of crimes is getting longer by the minute. I swear if I even see that woman again He interrupted his thoughts with a pinch to his wrist. Thank you, Akagi-san, he said. How long until he can be discharged? The nurse smiled at him gently. He can be discharged tomorrow morning. His heart is in fine working order and there seems to be no damage actually caused, thanks to the CPR performed on the scene. There was no brain damage due to an extended lack of oxygen. With all the drugs out of his system, he should be safe to recover his broken ribs outside of the hospital. It was as if someone opened a window and allowed a gust of fresh air to hit the hero. He was okay, Izuku was okay, and he was safe. At the thought, he felt the adrenaline high he'd been riding finally fade. The heavy exhaustion that came afterward had him stumbling momentarily. Fucking hell, he's alright. Good, I need a nap. I'm going to sit with the problem child. Whatever else needs to happen can happen in the morning or without me. He gestured roughly towards the detective and former hero before stepping towards the door. He paused for a moment as he stood in the doorway. If anything happens, you know where to find me, the hero added, before leaving the room with a start, ignoring the responses both men gave to his leave. He knew it was sudden, and he knew there was more that needed to be talked about. But at the moment, he couldn't care less. He wanted to take a nap where he could still hear his kid breathing, and he wanted to try and forget the image of the teen's limp, cold body that was engraved into his mind. More than that, he just needed some space from the two men. Yagi was all right to be around, if not awkward, and usually, Aizawa would describe himself as a comfortable acquaintances with Tsukachi. The vulnerable state he was forced into around the two tonight was not something he was comfortable with. He couldn't stand the thought of explaining himself to either of them, and he doubted he'd be able to look at Yagi for much longer without punching him in the face. So he did what he did best and left the uncomfortable social situation with practiced grace. The walk to the elevator was short, and the ride itself was quick, if not annoying due to the music playing. The walk from the elevator to Izuku's room was a short one as well. He pushed open the door as quietly as he could, thankful the hinges were well-oiled and slick as he tried to make his presence unknown. Then as soon as he could see inside, Shouta froze, standing over Izuku's bed. Easily 7 feet of heavy muscles and shiny black scales was a man Shouta had never seen before. A thick black tail hung down from the man's lower back. Easily as wide as Shouta and almost as tall, it swayed slightly then thumped against the tiled floor. The most dangerous part of this entire situation was that the man was holding Izuku. The teen was slotted in the Titan's arms, the blanket Yagi gave him earlier clinging to his shoulders. He looked so small, like the child he was. The way the man was holding him like a toddler didn't help the image. Shouta flashed his quirk almost instantly, readying his capture scarf with practiced ease as he hissed, "Put my student down." Right now, the Titan turned around to face Shouta and his mouth stretched in a toothy grin. He had large brown eyes and his face was covered in freckles. He had black curly hair with 2 horns popping out the top. His teeth were sharp and his canines extended downwards farther than they should have. He looked dangerous, yet there was an odd sort of familiarity about his face that Shouta couldn't place. "Ah, Racerhead, it's amazing to meet you. I apologize for the surprise. You see, I'm an underground hero as well and I've always admired your work. Do you think you could sign something for me, or maybe we could do a team-up?" His voice was deep but had a strange amount of excitement in it as the man began to ramble. "Who the hell are you?" He looked almost sheepish at the question, but paused as the teen began to murmur in his arms. "SHHH, little spark. It's okay, I'm here now," he muttered, almost reassuring the teen. Izuku seemed to melt at the words and began to cling more to the man. Shouta felt his quirk falter for a moment. The kid looked so soft and relaxed in the man's arms. He looked so young. "Who are you and why do you have my student?" the hero asked again, not bothering to hide the anger in his tone. "Again, Eraserhead, I'm very sorry. I'll explain everything in a moment, but please keep your voice down. Izuku needs his rest," the Titan begged, shooting a worried look at the teen before raising a clawed hand. His hands are completely scaled and gently scratching Izuku's head. Again, the teen melted into the touch with a soft hum of contentness. "Who are you?" Shouta demanded. The man's smile softened and his posture straightened. He grabbed a leather wallet from his pocket with his free hand and held it out and opened to Shouta. In the wallet, clear as day, was a perfectly normal-looking hero license with the man's face captured in image form attached to it. "You may know me as the Black Dragon." Shouta reached forward and took the wallet with doubtful hands. "However, right now, I'm here as Hisashi Kuraii, Izuku's father." The more he looked, the more he noticed the similarities. First, it was in the hair, dark and curly and untamable. Then the freckles, a galaxy of them dotted across both their faces. Then the smile, the way the man's eyes crinkled in the same way Izuku's did, and the awkward hand that clutched the back of his neck when he began to mumble. He must have stood there staring for an uncomfortable amount of time, but the man didn't seem bothered. In fact, his eyes were tracing over Shouta in the same way, searching pupils that darted from his eyes, to his hair, then to his scarf. They traced his arms and stalked down the rest of his body, scanning for threats, for weaknesses. Those were the eyes of a man assessing danger, a man with a well-practiced response to the unknown. Their eyes met, and neither man backed down. Shouta had heard rumors of a hero from America on the underground scene. A man covered in black scales who spit flames and stalked the night skies. The name was a tad on the nose. But he wasn't one to complain when his own hero name was Eraserhead. Maybe it was the high emotion of the night. Maybe it was the resemblance to Izuku, or maybe it was just his exhaustion taking over, but there was no pull of danger in his gut, no voice in his head screaming at him to run. There was just quiet confusion. He sighed and dragged a hand over his face, rubbing his pained eyes. Just put him back down, please. Or sit with him. I don't really care what, but you aren't taking him out of this room." The man obliged his commands and sat down on the hospital bed, the mattress creaking under his weight. He still held onto the teen. However, it was obvious there was no intention to trap Izuku. In fact, it seemed more like the dragon man himself was being trapped by his student. He had one arm wrapped around the teen's thighs, hiking him up on his hip, while Izuku's arms were wrapped around his neck in a vice-like grip. The teen stirred at the sudden movement, and Shouta saw as his eyes began to flicker open, small groans escaping him as he was coaxed into consciousness. The warmth enveloping Izuku was comfortable. He could feel the soft blankets draped over him, and where his skin met air, he was pleasantly surprised to find it was not the regular freezing cold of his room, but a comfortable warm temperature as well. He noticed the slight pull of the wrap around his waist and the odd but not unfamiliar scent of his environment. He wasn't lying down anymore. He was sitting up and crunched up against something warm and firm. He was lulled into consciousness by the slight movements of the thing he was clutching onto, rhythmic movements that matched up with his own heartbeat and breathing. The scent was unfamiliar but not entirely new. The thing smelt slightly smoky and faintly cinnamon-esque. It was a calming aroma, and he couldn't help but lean further into it. This thing felt familiar. It felt like his. There was a connection made in his mind that he couldn't quite place, yet it filled an empty spot he hadn't realized was there. Whatever this thing was, he was faintly aware that it was his and he was its. Like they were one and the same. He felt the thing beneath him grow slightly, then fall again. "I was worried you didn't smell right, but it is you, isn't it, Lil Spark?" a voice asked. The man's voice was like a soothing balm to his conscious mind, and he hummed in agreement with whatever was being said. He growled slightly as he felt the soft rumbling grow beneath him. Then he relaxed into it as he realized that more warmth seemed to be radiating from the source of the soft rumbles. That's my little dragon, all right. I need you to wake up now, Zuko. We need to do some talking with one of your adults here. He whined at the thought, and his whine only grew as something began to tug him off of the warmth. "SHH, easy now, kid." The voice reassured, and Izuku felt something scratch at his scalp in a circular motion. The feeling made him melt and forced a low grumble out of his throat. His arms loosened, and he was pulled off of the warmth with gentle but firm hands. He peeled his eyes open lazily and was greeted by the sight of Aizawa-sensei sitting on a firm cushioned chair in front of him. The man's eyes were trained on him, but kept flicking upwards and behind Izuku. His mind was moving slowly. Everything felt groggy, but the wariness on his teacher's face helped spark his brain awake. He blinked, deliberate and slow, before following the man's gaze up and behind Izuku's shoulder. He was greeted by the face of an unfamiliar man, way closer to him than what was expected. The first thing he noticed was the man's hair, unruly and curled up in a haircut much like Izuku's own. The black curls framing the man's face and hanging just above his brows. Next were the freckles. There were a whole galaxy of them dotted across the man's cheeks of various sizes and splatters, the sun decorating him with souvenirs of their time spent beneath it. Finally, he noticed the closeness of himself to the man and the fact that he seemed to radiate heat directly onto the spots where Izuku's body was touching him, since he appeared to be sitting on the man's lap. This was happening a lot. His brain short-circuited, and Izuku heard himself make an extremely pathetic squeaking noise that would have had left Kachin with way too much blackmail. He practically leapt out of the man's lap, which appeared to have been a terrible idea, as he could have sworn he heard his ribs literally creak at the motion. Another pitiful nose escaped him, this time more whiny, as he grabbed his midsection. He stumped backwards on his numb legs as they buckled slightly under him. He almost tripped over a long black appendage that was draped across the ground. Actually, screw almost. His heel caught on the appendage, and he would have fallen if not for the perpetrator of the tripping flying upwards to support his waist and prevent the further crumbling of his already damaged dignity. "Shit, kid, you're fast," the man chuckled. But the sound, the black appendage, which Izuku now realized was attached to the man as a scaly tail, had unraveled itself from Izuku and was retreating back to a comfortable rest on the floor. Izuku took another step back, only to find himself stopped by a large hand on his shoulder. He flinched momentarily, but eased when he glanced back and saw his teacher's face. Aizawa-sensei had a glare etched into his features, one that was aimed directly at the mysterious man. Izuku found it odd that despite Aizawa's apparent distrust of the man, he remained quiet and mostly calm while Izuku had literally been in his lap. "Kuraii, that's enough," his sensei said. Despite his body radiating exhaustion, his eyes glinted with something fierce as he gripped Izuku's shoulder. He could feel the wires crossing in his brain as he tried to make any sort of connection between his sensei and the strange man in his room. He felt a slight squeeze on his shoulder and glanced up to meet Aizawa's eyes, his face carrying a slightly different expression that Izuku couldn't place. "You all right, problem child?" His eyebrows furrowed at the question. Instead of answering immediately, he leaned a little further into his teacher's touch. It wasn't nearly as warm as the other man, but the warmth was nice nonetheless and had him subconsciously seeking more. He let out a soft hum of contentment that came up deep from his throat. It seemed to warm his body further, and Aizawa tilted his head in what Izuku assumed was confusion at the sound. "I'm fine, sensei. Just tired." He could have sworn Aizawa's lips twitched upwards with his words, but with how quickly his expression flattened, it could have been a trick of the light. "Izuku, do you know this man?" Aizawa asked, suddenly disrupting the almost soft moment they had shared. The question startled Izuku out of this comfort. He looked at the man again. He was staring at Izuku with large brown eyes, and his eyebrows pinched slightly. The man was massive, easily pushing the height of 7 feet, and with a thick frame of muscle that only made him larger. He had a long black and scaled tail that was easily 5 feet long and had other patches of black scales along his extremities and weaker areas like his neck and poking out across his collar. His hands and feet curled in claws that were also scaled and stretched much larger than someone's would without a quirk modifying them. Even with his mouth closed, Izuku could see the tips of canine teeth poking over his bottom lip and took notice of the 2 piercings over his bottom lip as well. Snake bites, they were called if he remembered correctly. The man's ears were also black and scaled, stretching back farther than any ordinary human ear and flicking seemingly randomly around the room, mostly towards the outside of the door. Izuku began to wonder if the man had an increased sense of hearing, and if so, how it worked compared to the ears of Shaoji or Jira. Knowing quirks, however, it was likely the hearing was more akin to Hawk's slightly increased senses due to his body's mutation. As the man heaved out an exhale, a puff of smoke came out of his nostrils. Izuku's eyes widened. Fire breathing. He wondered if that was why the man was so warm, if the fire was somehow stored inside of him, or if it was a flammable fluid his body produced paired with some sort of activation spark in his mouth. Except no, it couldn't be that, because then he wouldn't be able to puff out smoke like that. Maybe it was created in his throat. If so, then it would have avenues out of his nose and mouth. That must mean that he was somewhat fire-resistant as well, especially around his face. He wondered if it affected his breathing, or his sense of smell. It would be difficult to have enhanced smell when you were so often exposed to smoke, unless there was some sort of predetermined failsafe that blinded his body to the smell of his own flames. Did it act as an exhale? If so, was it related to the body's lung composition? If the lungs were quirk modified, that could cause some other issues, so maybe it was a different organ entirely that produced the flame. The man's face morphed into one of shock. Then he smiled widely, his lips stretching to show his oversized grin. Izuku got a better look at his canines and found that the rest of the man's teeth seemed to be sharper and longer as well, indicating possibly a mostly carnivorous diet. Izuku wondered if he still had square-shaped molars allowing him to comply to a human's classic omnivorous diet, or if his quirk made the man a complete carnivore. It wasn't unheard of for mutation quirks to change someone's dietary restrictions. For example, many people with blood quirks actually needed blood to be incorporated into their diet. Maybe that's what happened to Toga. Her obsession with blood could have been a result of being deprived of it. That deprivation could cause major psychotic tendencies that would definitely be enhanced by her only being able to drink the blood of those she's killed, thus associating the act of murder with a basic necessity of hers being fulfilled. It would also explain her obsession with those she has drank the blood of who have lived. It's a sort of gratefulness that's likely subconscious, like a stray cat hanging around someone that gave them food. Maybe that connection could be used to get her to change sides. In fact, he was almost certain that if someone promised her a decent supply of blood and actually followed through, then her psychotic tendencies would be completely eliminated. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a throat being cleared right next to him. He stopped and found his mouth open, tongue still morphed into the shape of his next word. He closed his mouth in shock. Oh God, oh no, I was muttering again. That's so horrible. He must have heard everything I thought about his quirk. Damn it, Izuku, you're so annoying. You know how creepy you are when you mutter damn it, and all those things about Toga must have sounded ridiculous. I swear if I could keep my mouth shut for once in my goddamn life. Again, his thoughts were interrupted. The man on the bed in front of him began to laugh. His eyes brightened and closed as a light giggle left his lips. His face crinkled in joy, and Izuku felt his face pinch in confusion. He looked back to see Aizawa's tired face wearing a new expression, one that terrified him to his very core. Aizawa was smirking. As much as I'd like to hear more of your analysis on Kuraii and Toga's quirks, wait, he would like to hear it. I still need you to answer the question, do you know this man, Izuku? And boy, that really was an odd question. Of course he didn't know this man, he'd never seen him before in his life. Wait, no, he remembered the photo, blurry and old and tucked into the gap between his mother's books. A small Polaroid with his mother and a strange man with black curly hair and sharp teeth smiling at the camera. Written on the back was, Inko and Hisashi. When Mom found him looking at it, that was one of the few times she truly got angry, screaming at him and ripping the photo from his hands with her quirk, tearing the picture itself in the process. He had been 7, and the photo was of his dad. He stared at the man openly and almost afraid. He looked older now, his face stretched with worry lines in his forehead and smile lines by his eyes. His hair was longer too, and styled slightly differently. He smelled like a campfire, fire-breathing. Dad, he broke again. His eyes flooded with tears as the word left his lips. So unfamiliar, so strange, yet so right. The man lit up at the single word, and Izuku saw his eyes well up with tears as well. But how? Why now? You left Mom when she was pregnant. Didn't want me. The man shook his head fiercely, his face wet with tears. No, of course I want you, Lil Spark. I've wanted you from the moment I found out you were mine. He wiped at his face and grabbed something from his pocket. It was a folded-up piece of paper. He unfolded it, and Izuku was greeted by his own face on the sheet. It was a series of images snapped from the sports festival. Some of them were of his fights, but most were from the quiet moments, when he was listening to an explanation or waiting for an event to start. My sister called me. She told me to watch the first year's sports festival. The man explained. Then I saw you and you just looked so much like Inko. Izuku's weakened heart clenched at the name. I knew I had to learn more about you. I didn't know why, but I felt like I needed to. When I found out she was your mother, I needed to know. I pulled up files. I spoke to other heroes, to old friends. The moment I found out you were mine, I've kept you with me. Izuku felt himself trembling, more and more tears falling down his face. Aizawa squeezed his shoulder again. He didn't know. His voice was trembling as well. Everything in his body screamed at him to just run towards the man, to hug him, to cry with him. But he had to know first. He had to know if he was right. She didn't tell me. She hid you away. That was all he needed. Izuku dived forwards, sobbing and reaching out towards the man, to Hisashi, to his dad. He caught him like he weighed nothing, picking him up and tucking him against his body. He was warm, oh so warm. And he not only smelled of campfire, but also of cinnamon. He clutched at his dad as he bawled. He felt so small, so scared yet so protected in his arms. Like he was taking the broken pieces of Izuku and putting them back together in a new way so that this time they actually fit. This was his dad. His dad was holding him. His dad wanted him. And his mom had lied to him. Again, he sobbed harder. It hurt. His ribs ached and his chest heaved, each breath taking more and more effort. He ached deep inside his chest like there was black hole sucking up everything. He hurt and he sobbed and he mourned. He mourned the loss of his mother, the loss of his trust, and the loss of his life. He mourned his childhood. He mourned the cold, air-conditioned apartment they'd shared, and most of all he mourned his mama. Because no matter how much she hurt him, no matter how much she kept from him, she was still his mom. She was still the woman who had kissed his skinned knees and held his hand crossing the street. He mourned the woman who sewed his first hero costume. He mourned the woman who patched up his cuts and bruises. He mourned the woman who had loved him. He cried and cried and cried until he couldn't anymore, until his tear ducts were dry and his voice was hoarse. And throughout it all, his dad held him, rubbing small circles into his back and rocking back and forth. He was so warm. There, kid, let it all out. I'm here. Your dad's here. My dad's here. For the third time that night, Izuku passed out. His eyes shut as he was warmed into unconsciousness. Aizawa and his father shared a look over the sleeping teen. This really was one hell of a night. I hope you know that I'm going to need a better explanation than that, Kuraii. Shouto wasn't just angry. No, he was downright furious. The man's brief explanation made a terrifying amount of sense. This wasn't the first time one of his students had been pseudo-scouted via the sports festival, and he doubted it would be the last. With Bakugo, his temper had been broadcast to the entire world. Heroes everywhere knew him as head-headed, and villains believed he was destined to be one of them. His kidnapping had been a direct result of the school event. Every day he regretted not pushing harder for its cancellation that year. But despite his protests, the festival went on and they were still facing the repercussions of it. Now, he was staring at the previously believed deadbeat father of one of his most troublesome students as the man tucked said student into a hospital bed. Fucking hell, he needed a nap, a long one. I would expect nothing less, Kuraii responded. The man stood up from where he was, leaned over and stretched out his back with a groan. I do hope that my explanation can wait until morning at least. I want Izuku to hear it as well, but the kid needs rest. And Eraserhead, the hero hummed in response. In the meantime, I'd like to find out why my son is in the hospital. And so, he told him. He left out some important details. One for All and the boy's subsequent connection to All Might were absolutely off the table. But other than those national secrets, he told the man everything that conspired within the last few hours. He knew he should have kept more to himself, but sue him, he was exhausted. And with the man being a pro, he was allowed certain leeway in what information he would be able to legally share. He had zero doubts about the man's identity by the end. Kuraii was almost silent throughout the entire tale. Underground heroics forced you to take news like this with straight expressions. No bullshit, no emotion. And he had to hand it to the man. He hid them well. Flickers of his anger still slipped through, most in the form of literal flickers of flame and slight growly noises whenever the man breathed out. But they were slight enough that a less trained individual would have no hope of noticing them. After his explanation was finished, the man groaned a low sound. For the first time in his interactions with Kuraii, Shouto felt his gut tighten. His mind was screaming danger. Something about his demeanor had changed. Where is she? He growled. Shouto allowed himself a slight intake of breath. Kuraii was angry. That much was obvious. But his anger was directed at him or Izuku. He wasn't a danger to Shouto or his student. Now, he felt his own anger bubble up inside him. Inko is being held at the precinct. Their best detective, and a friend of mine, is handling her interrogation. A manic grin stretched across the man's features. His eyes flashed red for a moment out of habit. Kuraii looked enraged. I think I'll pay her a visit. Shouto couldn't help the matching grin that attacked his own features, stretching his lips around sharp teeth. The cruel, vindictive part of him couldn't help but enjoy the idea of Inko being forced to confront the father of her child. There was also the added bonus of Tsukachi being there to validate Kurai's story. His vindictive side won out and he pulled out his phone. I'll tell the detective. It took less than 3 minutes for the interrogation to pick up speed. 2 minutes and 37 seconds precisely. At first glance, Inko was distraught. She sobbed and demanded to see her son, to make sure her little Izu was all right. She babbled about her worries, and she seemed completely clueless as to the fact that Izuku had been hurt due to her action. She was brought into the interrogation room and left alone at the table. Then, she went quiet. A steady line of tears were still streaming down her face, but she waited in otherwise silence until someone else joined her in the room. The detective entered the room, trying to exude a nonchalant nature. He wanted Inko to feel comfortable for now. She didn't have to know that they were investigating her. Hello ma'am, I'm Detective Tsukachi. Can you tell me what happened this evening? He took his time with his words, getting comfortable with a hot cup of coffee and a recording device before he had even opened his mouth. Ordinarily, He was required to inform all individuals he interrogated of his quirk. However, there were specific situations where he was allowed to make an exception to that rule. One of those exceptions occurred when he was speaking with someone suspected of abuse. Keeping his quirk under wraps was an easy way to quicken the pace of these investigations and get the victim away from the abuse quickly. Or in the case that no such abuse was happening, then both people could return to their ordinary lives. Either way, use of his quirk helped. It was an exception he made use of lots. Inko's story was overall normal. She spoke of her worries when she saw her son, saying he looked exhausted and anxious. She told him how she'd made him his favorite foods and drinks to take care of him, and when he became dizzy and drowsy she thought he was just tired and led him to the couch for a nap. That hero school really isn't good for Izu, she started. He shouldn't have even gone in the first place. I don't know how his quirk came in so late, but he was better off without it. My poor boy is always getting hurt now that he doesn't have me to take care of him. Her tears had faded by now. At this point, she looked more angry than anything, rolling her lower lip between her teeth in what Tsukachi assumed was a nervous tic. All of her words rang true, but the detective didn't miss the left-out information or the little pauses as she spoke, as if she was dancing around something. The woman continued rambling. I hope that Hero Eraserhead gets what's coming to him. I can't believe he hurt my poor boy like that while he was resting. At that, the detective blanched, his bored facade cracking. He had been mid-sip of his coffee and began to choke as what she had said rang as true. She truly believed that she hadn't done anything that had hurt her son. She genuinely believed that Izuku had been fine before Eraserhead had arrived on scene. The idea made him tremble with rage. If Eraserhead hadn't shown up when he did, if he'd given Izuku just a bit more leeway, then it was certain the teen would have been dead. All the while his mother would have been none the wiser. Tsukachi hadn't seen Izuku much when he had first arrived, but he had seen the boy's pale face and purple tongue lolling out of his mouth. It had been unmistakable that the boy had been dead, yet his mother hadn't even noticed. Hadn't noticed or hadn't cared. His mind supplied unhelpfully. Midoriya-san, he started calmly. Eraserhead did not hurt your son. In fact, he is the only reason Izuku is still alive right now. He made sure to triple-check that he was still recording as he spoke. Inko's face twisted into something terrible, and she glared at Tsukachi, standing up from the table suddenly. You are lying. Izuku was perfectly fine. I was taking care of him. I always do. It was that damned hero and that school that did this to him, corrupting my poor little Izu, making him believe he could be a hero. My precious boy shouldn't have even had a quirk. I made sure of that. I protected him, she yelled, bits of spittle flying across the table. Or maybe she's delusional. Midoriya-san, I need you to sit down now or I will be forced to call security. He wiped the spit off of his face and kept his tone calm and collected even as he felt his heart spike at her last sentence. Shouldn't have even had a quirk. True, I made sure of that. True. She may not have realized yet, but she had admitted something that would be incriminating. Now, he needed to keep her talking. She took a few deep breaths, then her face flushed with heat and she sat back down, smoothing her skirt and bowing. She seemed to switch between each persona like someone was flicking on and off a light. Possible mental illness, flipping emotions, delusion-fueled ideas. I am very, very sorry, detective. I didn't mean to be so cruel. I was allowing my emotions to take hold of me. She apologized, the face of a concerned mother taking over her features once more. Her words again rang as true. He worried how skewed this woman's ideals had to be to justify how she'd drugged Izuku, yet not justify acting unkindly to a detective. It is quite understandable, ma'am, he reassured with false care. Truly he hoped she would react more, give him more dirt so they could stick their charges. I'm going to ask you some basic questions now and I'd appreciate it if you answer them as honestly as possible. She nodded in response and gave the man a sweet smile that had his stomach rolling as it truly seemed genuine. Now, what is your name in relation to Midoriya Izuku? My name is Inko Midoriya. True, and Izuku is my son. True. Tsukachi mentally crossed out several theories related to the possibility of her not being his biological mother and continued. Do you or Izuku have any other immediate family? She paused at that, biting her lip. Izuku's father is in America, and my parents are dead. My brother visits sometimes, but it's been a while since I've seen him. True. Something was off about the way she mentioned the boy's father, and something prickled in his mind. There was a half-truth somewhere in that sentence. Is Izuku's father present in either of your lives? No, he left, ran away when I got pregnant. Truth and two lies. Oh, he prompted, careful to keep his posture open. He's a no-good deadbeat. Lie didn't want kids lie, so he left me to raise little Izu all by myself. She pouted and he saw tears form at the corners of her eyes. A decent performance and one he may have been inclined to believe if his quirk wasn't pinging at every other word. Inko was lying, telling a well-practiced tale that painted her in a sympathetic light. I'm sorry, he gritted out. That must have been hard. Just play along, earn her trust, get more info. It was. She nodded solemnly, her shoulders relaxing. Moving on, could you tell me the nature of yours and Izuku's father's quirks? Oh, her shoulders tightened again. Well, mine is a simple telekinesis. I can attract small objects towards me. Hisashi had a fire-breathing quirk. Truth and a half-truth. Again about Izuku's father. Is there anything more to his quirk? No, just the fire, that's it. Lie. Her voice was frantic, almost panicked. He saw her hands clutching at the fabric of her skirt tightly. I don't see what this has to do with Izuku. Okay, stay calm, stick to the questions, keep your posture relaxed. It's just basic procedure, Midoriya-san. Could you tell me what Izuku ate and drank at her home tonight? She gave him a quick rundown of the food and its ingredients. Is that everything? He asked again. Once she was done listing ingredients, she wrung her hands together under the table and readjusted her seat. Yes, there was nothing else in the food I made. She lied, her lips pinched together. When can I see Izuku? Her tone was urgent, almost pleading. Soon, I promise. He placated. Only a few more questions, again just basic procedure. She let out a soft sigh, then sat straighter. At those words, the doors to the interrogation room opened wide and in came several officers. One held the box full of quirk suppressant cuffs they'd found under Inko's bed. The other held a new box that was filled with the powders they had found in the woman's duffel. She gasped as they placed both the boxes on the table with a thud. Sukachi dutifully kept his face blank. Can you tell me what is in these boxes, Midoriya-san? He tried to keep the accusation out of his tone. They were found inside of your home. And no, she startled, jumping up from her seat. She looked around the room with begging eyes. I've never seen those suppressants in my life. Lie. A heavy pause came after. He felt his lips twitch up slightly. I never said they were suppressants. With that, the silence grew thicker. One moment, then another, then. Midoriya and Inko snapped. I wanted to help him. These were helping him. Keeping him safe and normal and I can protect him. Please, this is good. He's supposed to be quirkless, he needed to be. He can't be a hero, no he can't. He can't get those gross scales and I needed to protect him. My little Izu, please, you don't understand. She alternated between yelling and threatening to pleading softly and begging. Much of her words barely muttering as the officers approached her. She jumped away from the table and shoved the boxes off. The cuffs clattered across the floor. No, you don't get it. He couldn't have that quirk. He couldn't have his father's. Midoriya and Co. You are under arrest for possession of an illegal drug, providing substances to a minor, drug abuse, quirk growth negligence, quirk neglect, third-degree attempted murder, falsifying quirk and other government documents, and illegal drug testing. Everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, he continued on with the usual spiel as his officers placed the wailing woman in handcuffs. Please, I just wanted to keep him safe, please. She continued begging. Sukachi felt his vindictive joy falter. As much as he hated what she had done, she was telling the truth. She believed that she was helping, that she was genuinely doing what was best for her son. Honestly, that made this so much worse. Midoriya-san, he prompted gently. The woman met his eyes with a sniffle. Izuku went into cardiac arrest tonight due to a drug overdose, an overdose on the quirk suppressants that you gave him. Her resolve faltered. He could see something crumble in her mind as for a moment she stopped spluttering. I did that, she asked, and her voice sounded so young, so innocent in that moment. Sukachi had long since stopped smiling. Yes, ma'am, you did that. She paused and opened her mouth to say something, then closed it. Something seemed to shut off inside her. She stared ahead blankly as the officers walked her out of the room, no one saying a word. The moment the door had closed behind his officers, Sukachi felt his eyes fill with tears. He slumped into the chair and curled himself over the table. No matter how long he'd done this job, no matter how many cases he dealt with, some still hit him harder than others. He was a sensitive man, and cases like these drained him. Inko had done cruel things. The charges pressed against her were serious and didn't paint a pretty picture, but she truly loved her son. She truly believed that everything she had done had been what was best for him. Despite her skewed perspective, she loved Izuku. Yet she warped that love to justify horrible things. It hurt more than if she were just some cruel, manipulative abuser. Then at least he could comfortably hate her without an ounce of sympathy. But hearing her words, seeing her distress and panic was something he hadn't expected. She was so human, so lost, and so twisted. Prison time was unavoidable and well-deserved. Yet she needed help as well. He took a shaky breath. The image of Izuku puking and sobbing while attached to life support devices in the ambulance came to mind. He had to stay focused. He had to remember what the consequences of Inko's actions had been. He had to remember that they didn't even know the full consequences yet. He couldn't afford to feel sympathy for the woman, no matter how twisted her psyche may be. He exhaled slowly, forcing the tears away from his eyes before sitting up. He dragged a trembling hand over his face, easing some of the tension between his brows before taking a long sip of his coffee. He heard the clicking of the lock and twisting of the metal door as it dragged open along the linoleum floor. Sir, Eraserhead is on the line. Says he needs to talk to you, that it's urgent. He let out a low, grumbly sigh, squeezing his eyes together for a moment before standing and making his way to the door. The officer in the doorway paused, giving him a curious glance. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. He looked the woman up and down, stopping at her face. She was new, freshly out of training and rising the ranks quickly. She gave him a kind yet wobbly smile. "Officer Vari, if he remembered correctly." "It's been a long night," he answered, trying to return her wobbly grin. Then he let out a soft chuckle. "After tonight, I think I'm going to need a month off." She chuckled slightly in response, and Tsukachi reveled in the moment of peace they shared. "Now, let's see what Eraser needs." Straightening out his posture and putting on a calm facade was surprisingly easy for Tsukachi. The precinct was currently on its night shift, and the officers employed for this time were good at discretion. This was the crew that often dealt with underground heroes and more nefarious villains after all. He received and returned a few nods as he walked, but other than that, he and Officer Vari were left alone as they trudged to his office. She held the door open for him and he gave her a grateful smile. "He's on line 4. If you need anything, just let me know," she said, matching his grin with a soft one of her own. "Thank you, Vari-san. Have a good night." With that, the door shut behind him. He walked towards his desk and began fiddling with the phone. It was an older design, one more similar to a landline and one he was still getting used to. He saw that line 4 had a red light beside the button. He pressed said button and held the phone to his ear. "Hello, this is Tsukachi." "Hey detective, took you long enough. How was the initial interrogation?" Aizawa Shouda's voice echoed over the line, the slightest hint of teasing evident in its tone. He let out a long sigh. "Exhausting. She's severely mentally ill. She believed that she was helping Izuku. We only spoke long enough to solidify some charges and answer some of our more preliminary questions. We've got a lot more we still don't know and I'm hoping that maybe she can give us some answers." For now he was tired, and legally it would be frowned upon to interrogate her further without a lawyer's presence. Actually, he perked up at the man's tone. Something odd he couldn't place was lacing his voice. "I might have some answers as well." His eyebrow quirked up at that. "Oh, did Izuku say something?" "No, but his father did." What? His mouth helpfully supplied. He heard Aizawa let out a puff of air over the phone. He was sure the man was suppressing a snort. "Hisashi Kuraii just showed up at the hospital. He's a pro too, some underground hero in America. Apparently he just found out he had a kid. He's there. With you." There was an edge of excitement in his voice. He couldn't help it. The short story fit with what he knew. He felt giddy when the strings of his cases began to weave together and make sense. He would need to speak with the man, to confirm his story and ask his own questions. What was his quirk? How did he find out about Izuku? How was his relationship with Inko? Was she always this twisted? No, he wanted to have a talk with Inko. The hero's voice pitched slightly off-kilter at the word talk. He shivered at the implication. He should be there in a couple of minutes if he hasn't shown up already. Apparently flying is pretty quick. "Flying? Show up here." "Wait, no. I'm sorry, Eraser. I'm afraid I don't understand." He feigned ignorance, hoping maybe he had misunderstood and that Eraser hadn't decided to throw him under the bus like the cruel. "I told him the location of the precinct. He's coming to speak with you, give his own statement, and hopefully shed some light on the situation." Good luck. Cruel and sadistic asshole he was. "Got him at Aizawa," he nearly shouted. "You can't just pawn this off on me with barely a moment's notice." A long, high tone disrupted his scolding. He hung up the phone. Eraser had hung up on him. "That fucking asshole." A frantic knocking interrupted his insult. He couldn't help the obnoxious groan from leaving his throat. "I'm going to kill him. I'm actually going to kill him." He slammed the phone back onto the receiver and stomped towards the door. Swinging it open, Sansa stumbled through the open doorway, panic staining his features. His fur puffed up and stood on edge. "Sir, there's a hero here. The Black Dragon, sir, said that he's made arrangements to speak with you." Sansa uttered, words tumbling out of his mouth as he tried to right his stance. His pupils kept flickering between enlarged and slimmed. With a quick glance downwards, he saw that the man's claws were flexing in and outwards as well. Everything he was doing was displaying signs of pure, instinctual fear. He forced his glare to disappear, any frustration left from the phone call immediately melting away in favor of concern for his friend. "It's all right, Sansa," Eraser sent him. He tried to calm. The man relaxed a minuscule amount at that. "Friend." He placed a hand on the man's shoulder and he flinched so hard Tsukachi almost moved away. "Why don't you head home for the night? It's well past your ordinary hours and you won't do us any good without rest." The officer heaved a couple of breaths before relaxing his posture. "I'm all right. He's just big, really big. Cat instincts and all that." He gave the man's shoulder a tight squeeze. "Even so, it's late. Go home, Sansa. I'll call if I need you." The man huffed an affirmative before leading Tsukachi out of his office and towards the precinct's main foyer, a small area usually reserved for waiting families and surface-level social interactions. Taking up an impressive amount of space in the center was a titan of a man who watched with dark eyes as they entered the room. He had to have been well over 6 feet tall, his height matching or even exceeding that of Endeavor's. His build, though obviously muscled, wasn't as thick as the Flame Hero's. His muscles were more toned and lean, only accentuated by his body's natural behemoth size. He had black curly hair with a well-kept undercut ringing around his head, the black curls falling over it heavily. Where the curls ended by his ears, dark scales replaced it. His ears stretched with a dark shine and a less than human shade and shape. Probably the most striking features of the man lay in his obvious mutations. The most obvious of those being in the thick, long reptile tail that thumped on the tiles and the folded scaled wings that decorated his back. Currently, the wings were pinned against his back. However, he estimated that when open, the wingspan would be well over 15 feet. Everything about him screamed predator, from his obvious physical mutations to the tilted head he used to examine Tsukachi and his officer. He didn't blame Sansa for poofing up earlier. If he had fur, he was sure he would be doing the same. As it were, his arm and neck hairs were already standing on edge as goosebumps rattled across his frigid skin. He noticed faintly that Sansa had edged himself out of the room, leaving the detective alone with the man. Good, I hope he gets some sleep. Despite his instincts screaming at him to run, he stood his ground and further examined the hero. Black compression shirt and dark gray cargo pants, casual yet practical, easy to hide weapons. Larger than average hands, completely scaled, sharp, black nails, talons, claws. He wasn't sure exactly what they were, but they were different. Then up to the face, surprisingly youthful cheeks, remnants of baby fat that likely never fully disappeared. Dark freckles that littered the entire face, smile lines around the eyes, worry lines on the forehead. Big, brown eyes now narrowed, sharp teeth poking out from the lip, 2 metal rings digging in under his lower lip. A heaving exhale and a small puff of smoke. A long tongue flicked out to taste the smoke, rough-looking and forked at the end. Though, his mind flickered back to his conversation with Izuku, the sudden change of the appendage inside his mouth and the flickering tips of the forked tongue as he wrapped it around pronunciations he used to be familiar with. A strange initial mutation, one that he shared with the man before him. Suddenly, the man's face stretched into a wide, bright smile. Something that so easily contradicted his earlier demeanor it had Tsukachi reeling with the whiplash. Hello, detective. Tsukachi, yes. I'm Hisashi Kuraii. The man greeted, his voice deep and slightly rasped. He reached out a hand towards the detective, then paused and yanked it away before falling into an uncomfortably low bow. My apologies. It's been an awful long while since I've been in Japan. I'm afraid America may have rubbed off on me. The man looked almost sheepish, his cheeks dusted with light pink. For a moment, he was reminded of his first interactions with Izuku. His shy and polite nature, the sheepish way in which he apologized for something that didn't quite necessitate it, the endearing embarrassment that seemed to follow the boy around unfamiliar social interactions. He allowed a slight smile to pull at his lips. It's quite all right, sir. May I see your hero license? He asked the man, who scrambled up and began to pat down his pockets. Ah, yes, of course, here you are. The small leather wallet was thrust into his hands. He unfolded it and startled as several things tried to fall out of the open wallet, not secured in any of its pockets. He fumbled and managed to avoid dropping the folded paper and the card, which he realized was the man's hero license. He raised a brow as he made eye contact with the man. Kuraii reached a hand up to scratch at his neck. Aw shit, sorry. I was rushing and he held up a hand to stop the man, letting his eyes rake over the license. After he deemed it legitimate, he tucked it into the open slot of the wallet and handed it and the folded paper back to the hero. He put on a more serious expression and made tentative eye contact with the hero. Everything looks to be in order. What do you need from me? The man took a moment to stuff his wallet back into his pocket before speaking. I'm here to speak with you about my son, about Izuku Midoriya. True Eraserhead said that you were in charge of his case and told me to come to you, but True. The hero continued to mutter, though at this point, his mutters had divulged into something unintelligible for the detective. He let out an amused sigh, again his mind forcing him to relive the parallels between this man and the teen. Kuraii-san, before you say anything more, why don't you follow me to somewhere a bit more private? Maybe then we can have an actual conversation. The hero's face reddened as he was jolted out of his mutters. He gave the detective another vibrant smile and straightened his posture. Of course, that would be much better than continuing to make a fool of myself here in the entrance. He let out an embarrassed chuckle. Tsukachi couldn't stop his response of a chuckle of his own. Something about the man's personality straying so far from his appearance was almost endearing. It was amusing to say the least to see this titan act so sheepish. He led the hero through the precinct. He debated using an interrogation room, but decided against it. After all, the couches in his office would be much more comfortable for the both of them. He was not about to force the man to fit his tail and wings onto the tiny steel chairs of the interrogation rooms either. Actually, he was meaning to send an email in regards to the chairs anyways. You'd think in a society where mutations were so common a police precinct would at least be better prepared for them. Alas, that was not the case. He sighed internally and led the hero into his office. He gestured towards the open couches off to the side and turned around to shut and lock the door. He figured that they'd both rather be uninterrupted. The hero took a seat on the couch against the wall and brought his tail up and into his lap, fiddling with the scales as he sat and waited for the detective. He took his time walking across his office, his steps lacking the urgency he felt. The scaled wings that seemed so large on the hero earlier seemed to be shrinking by the moment, getting smaller and smaller against his form. The hero caught him staring and twisted slightly to show off his wings. My wings are sort of retractable. They can fully disappear into scaled mounds on my back and grow back to full size in an instant. They take a couple minutes to shrink down, he explained. Tsukachi watched the wings collapse into his shoulders. The compression shirt had 2 holes torn in the back where the wings must have ripped through. I suppose it would be rather inconvenient if they simply stayed at full size. Hawks liked to complain about his own getting in the way. The man nodded in understanding. That used to be quite the issue when I was younger. They would pop out whenever I was surprised, or excited, or really happy, or angry, or well, pretty much during any big emotion. A lot of my younger years were spent just trying to stop them from popping out and slapping my classmates. The man told the story with a smile, his tone amused and slightly embarrassed. He felt himself relax at the personal story and took a seat on the armchair in front of the man. So, I have many questions, he started, but before I ask them, I'm hoping to hear your side of the story. I have a quirk that allows me to tell when someone is lying, so I'm able to personally verify your story. As further evidence, I will be recording this conversation. Kuraii nodded in understanding. He paused for a moment, then let out a weary sigh. So Kuraii, tell me what led you here today, he prompted after starting the recording. Another pause, and a sigh. My name is Hisashi Kuraii. True, I changed it when I graduated from high school and received my hero license. My previous surname was Tatsuma. True, he recognized the surname. Though he wasn't sure where from, I wanted to protect mine and my family's identities, so I changed it before I took a job overseas. He paused and chuckled to himself. Now that I'm thinking about it, you probably know my sister, Ryuko, or as her dear fans call her, Ryukyu. She's how I found out about my kid about Izuku. True. All still true. The hero paused again, before wiping at his eyes furiously. I didn't know I had a son until a couple of weeks ago. True. The man took a moment, seemingly composing himself, before sitting up straight and heaving out a long breath of heated air. Tsukachi waited, still with bated breath. Around 16, almost 17 years ago now, I believe. I was still a pretty young hero. I was 20 and stupid, and I got hurt pretty badly. True. The timeline matches with his hero license. No inconsistencies yet. That would make him 36 or 37 today, same age as me. That's how I met Inko, he continued. She was a nurse in the hero ward of the hospital at the time. She took care of me, nursed me back to health. She was my senior by almost 10 years. But we got along so well we decided to try dating despite the age difference. True, she was always kind and caring, doting on the people she loved. It was nice, but it got overwhelming. We argued a lot. She didn't like to see me hurt, but as a hero it was pretty much inevitable. She fretted over every little scratch and bruise. She tried to get me to quit heroics. She wanted me to settle down and get some cushy office job. That was kind of the last straw. We broke up a little after a year together and we haven't spoken since. All true. Everything he said so far lined up with the image of Izuku Midoriya he had built up in his own brain. Being a pro was difficult. It strained your relationships, especially those with non-pros. It was rare that heroes could make a romantic relationship with a civilian work. Usually, they paired up with each other or no one at all. Tsukachi only knew one pro who was currently in a relationship with a civilian, and that was Rock Lock. Inko didn't want the person she loved getting hurt. She must have really hated it if she would go as far as to ask him to quit being a hero. He could understand how that was the final straw for Kuraii. Still, it didn't explain why she would go so far as to hide her son's existence. Unbeknownst to his internal conflict, Kuraii continued, Ryuko was only 10 at the time. We've got different moms, but we were always close. She never liked Inko, but I figured she'd just forgotten about the relationship. Kind of like I did, if I'm being entirely honest. True, that answers my question about the age gap. The fact that this story included another pro would make everything easier to corroborate. However, trying to get an interview with one of the top 10 was not something he was looking forward to. We talk on the phone pretty often, and a couple months ago she called me, all excited, and asked me to watch the first year's sports festival. I thought she found someone she wanted to grab as an intern or something. Sukachi knew where this was going. He'd seen both Izuku and his mother. He knew firsthand how alike they looked. He could imagine the confusion the hero must have felt seeing Izuku, especially once he realized the teen's age. Then I saw Izuku. He immediately made me think of Inko. The hero said the name of the woman solemnly, a smidgen of regret lacing his tone. I brushed it off at first. None of the quirks matched up, so I ignored it. But I couldn't get him out of my brain. Kuraii paused again, taking a shaking breath, claws twitching around his tail. Telltale signs of stress, yet still his story remained truthful. Ryuko did some digging and found out that Izuku was Inko's kid, and that there wasn't a father in the picture. Things kind of snowballed from there. The room lapsed into silence. Sukachi let that silence fall. He could tell that the hero still had more to say and wasn't about to interrupt him. It was at least 30 seconds before either of them said a word. It was Kuraii who opened his mouth again. I came here because a part of my family's genetics allows all of us dragon quirks to smell when someone is one of our own, well, blood related. True, while something like this was not unheard of in the world of quirks, it was certainly rare. Sukachi never ceased to be amazed by the intricacies of mutation quirks and how far some truly went into changing the physiology of a person while still being able to be considered technically human. It must be something scent-related, like a sort of pheromone. He'd read about pheromones before, even been forced to deal with them as explanations for some strange behaviors from certain heteromorphs around springtime. The idea had always seemed strange to him, but you couldn't deny biology. They would still have to do a DNA test, but that would be quick and easy. Yanking himself away from his internal monologue, he took care to notice the look of guilt on Kurai's face, the way he pursed his lips, the soft puffs of smoke that released at every exhale, the watery gleam in his eyes. I needed to know for sure, so that's why I am here. The hero huffed and made direct eye contact with Sukachi. I saw him at the hospital. He looks so small. Fuck, and I haven't been here. I've missed so much. I have a son, he's my son Izuku, but fuck, I can't even call myself his father. A twisted sob ripped out of the man's throat, a wicked sound that had Sukachi's heart clenching. The hero ducked down, breaking eye contact and clawing at his face as tears streamed down it. What can I even do? What can I say? I don't know how to be a dad. I never got the chance to figure that out. The final word he almost choked out. His voice became warbled and wet. I want to have custody of him. I want to take care of him. I want to be his dad. How can I even do that? He asked, and Sukachi finally took that as his turn to speak. First things first. We'd need an official DNA test. Then we'd need to go about adding you to his birth certificate. The man looked up from his lap, staring at the detective with wide, wet eyes. Until then, Izuku, your son. The man gave him a grateful smile as more tears slipped out of his eyes. Will be in the custody of UA, with Shouta Aizawa as his guardian. His homeroom teacher was the most likely candidate, at least. Though he was certain that Toshinori would give the man a run for his money, he ultimately knew that his friend did not have the capabilities to care for a teenager full-time, not when his own health was in such bad shape. Before anything else happened, though, he needed to finish asking his questions. One look at the hero, however, had him pausing. The man sniffled wetly, and with that he supposed it wouldn't hurt to give him a few moments to compose himself before they continued. He made up his mind, and took to his feet, pausing the recording in a simultaneous motion. Before anything else happens, I'm going to grab us some coffee, he stated, giving a soft smile to the hero, who returned it with an albeit wobbly smile of his own. And if he let that smile tug on his heart, then that was no one's business but his. He took a singular step and almost slipped before just barely catching himself on the armrest. Looking down curiously, he noticed with a shock that the man's tears had managed to create a small puddle on the floor of his office. Maybe they wouldn't need that DNA test after all. Sunlight streamed through the open windows of Izuku's hospital room. The window was held open a few inches, allowing a slight breeze to come through the screen and the sounds of chirping birds and humming car engines to seep into the room. Shouta came to consciousness the same way he had several other times that very night, with a startling jolt and an uncomfortable twinge in his neck from the strange position he was slumped in on the hospital chair. He blinked his eyes slowly, bringing a hand up to rub away the remaining sleep and ease the dull throbbing behind them. It had been well past midnight when he had finally dozed off, and even that crappy excuse for sleep was interrupted several times throughout the night. The hospital chair was not the most uncomfortable place he'd slept before, not by a long shot, but it still wasn't pleasant and granted his rest no favors. He raised his eyes to the bundle of blankets on the hospital bed, a soft snoring, almost rumbling noise emanating from the pile. Since Kuraii had made his appearance and helped Izuku through his emotional crash, the boy had been all but dead to the world the rest of the night. The comparison sent a jolt of panic through him, and for probably the 20th time that night he reached over and grabbed Izuku's hand. He felt for a pulse and relaxed minutely when he felt blood pumping strongly beneath his fingers. This routine was repeated so often throughout the night that Shouta no longer had to search to find the pulse point. He immediately knew where it was and zeroed in on it. Izuku's left hand that was closest to him was one of the only parts of his body not enveloped by blanket, simply because his subconscious body had gotten tired of constantly tucking it back beneath the sheets and simply let it rest outside them, easily within Shouda's reach. As if a part of him knew the ease it would bring to his teacher, he dragged a hand over his face, suppressing his upcoming yawn, and stood from the chair with a muffled groan. He went through a few basic stretches, enough to ease the strain of his joints and feel his hips and back pop a dozen times until he was loose and comfortable. On the other side of Izuku's bed, another of the more comfortable hospital chairs was pulled up close beside it. The chair was currently vacant, though the jacket hung over the back and the bookmarked novel on the bedside table indicated that its owner had not gone far. That was another thing that changed last night. Now that Shouda was made aware of the relationship shared between Yagi and his student, the man seemed all the more willing to show that closeness. Shouda, however, would be a hypocrite to call out the man for it. He knew that his care for the teen had easily skyrocketed that very night as well. The idea of leaving his side was not within the realm of possibilities for Shouda. Not when the very idea of being away from his problem child had his blood pressure sky high and his breaths coming in short gasps. Thus the two had sat in relative silence for the majority of the night at Izuku's bedside, only dutifully acknowledging each other when they both happened to have awakened at the same time. He was sure that Yagi had slept even less than himself, judging by the position of the bookmarked page in the novel relative to the position he'd seen it in when the man had first taken out the book. That observation had been correct. He couldn't deny that he worried for the former hero. The man had run himself into the ground with his work and even now refused to slow down. Shouda had taken to carrying handkerchiefs for the man for when he had forgotten his own. He knew it wasn't much, but a part of him felt like he owed the man something for being the symbol of peace all these years, for carrying most of hero society on his shoulders alone. Hisashi and Nimuri, though originally teasing him about it, had taken to carrying some handkerchiefs as well for the former number one. The trend had spread and now the majority of the staff carried backups for the man. Even Shouda couldn't deny that the look on the former hero's face when he coughed and was presented with an option of 4 handkerchiefs from various staff members was hilarious, even more so when a similar situation repeated itself with the students. It was needless to say that the health of the man concerned him, and his apparent lack of sleep certainly didn't help that concern. Shouda would be a hypocrite to say anything himself. Thus he had no intention of staging any sort of intervention for the former hero at this time. Maybe he could rope Hisashi and Nimuri into rallying the students to do it. The man would probably listen more if he had the begging eyes of Class 1A to influence him. His speculations were interrupted by an insistent buzzing from his pocket. From the moment he was conscious, it had been in his pocket, sounding more akin to a hive of angry bees than anything. As much as he was dreading the onslaught of messages his phone must have received, he couldn't ignore the device any longer. Nezu needed an update, along with the rest of the staff. He'd bet a pretty penny on the fact that his students were likely harassing them for answers on the whereabouts of their friend and teacher. He couldn't stop the almost fond smile that came to his face at the idea of his students harassing his coworkers. It was only fair they had to deal with the problem children without him every once in a while. A particularly insistent buzz prompted his action. He glanced back at the sleeping teen once more. Seeing he was still unconscious, he gave the pulse a quick check, almost habit at this point, and took his phone out of his pocket. Immediately, he was greeted by 15 messages from Hisashi, 6 from Nimuri, 10 plus for the staff group chat, and over 20 from the Class 1A group chat. Temporarily ignoring all of those messages, he opened the one and only message from his boss. One new message from Rat Bastard. Hisashi has threatened to show your class the pictures if you do not respond to him. I'll admit, I'm rather curious myself. He felt his face heat up. He knew exactly what pictures Hisashi had in mind, and he would never live it down if any member of his Hell class saw them. A brief flashback of the smell of alcohol and the scratchy texture of the dress he was wearing flashed across his mind. He shuddered at the memory. Fucking Nimuri and her fucking drunken dares. Without another moment, he opened his husband's messages and sent a quick text saying that he and Izuku were all right but in the hospital. He made sure to tell him not to tell the Hell class anything. If one of them found out, they all would. Then he would have to deal with 19 students trying to sneak off the campus to check on them. Another message came from Nezu moments after he'd sent his response to Hisashi. Oh, and please tell the Black Dragon I said hello. Shouda took another moment to process that message. How the hell does the rat know everything? You know what? What did I even expect? He couldn't help the grimace that pulled on his lips. He wondered what else his boss already knew. Actually, scratch that. Nezu probably already knew everything he did and more. Fucking hell, of course the rat already knows everything, goddamn menace. Sensei. The soft voice interrupted his disgruntled spiel. He hadn't even realized he was speaking aloud until that interruption. Shouda stared at the pile of blankets on the hospital bed. The soft snoring that was previously filling the room had disappeared, and the blankets had adjusted so that Izuku's green mop of hair was poking out along with the rest of his head. His wide green eyes stared at Shouta, then darted around the room, taking in the environment. He immediately stashed his phone back into his pocket. The rest of the world could wait. Without much more thought, he sat down and reached over to place his hand on top of Izuku's scarred own. He gave into a firm squeeze. "Hey problem child, how are you feeling?" he asked, taking care to keep his tone neutral. At the question, Izuku's face pinched and he began to roll his neck awkwardly. "Sore?" Shouta further asked, and the teen nodded in response. "Figures, the doc said that would be normal for a while. Until your quirk is finished developing at least." The teen nodded his head in understanding, and Shouta was hit with the sudden realization that Izuku thought his soreness was related to his overdose. Fuck, that's right. He doesn't know. In that moment, Shouta truly understood what his students meant by being saved by the bell. As before he had the chance to attempt an explanation, the hospital door began to creak open. Standing in the doorway in all of his skeletal glory was Yagi Tashinori. He was dressed differently than last night, changed into a dark green sweater and a pair of far too baggy jeans. He was holding in one hand a white plastic bag filled takeout and the other a drink tray carrying 3 large hot drinks. Shouta smelled coffee and almost felt himself begin to salivate. "Ah, young Izuku, you are awake." Yagi stepped through the entrance, his dramatic timing making up for the lack of his usual theatrics. "Hi all might," Izuku greeted, his voice taking on an unusual, almost growly tone, further reminding Shouta of the conversation he needed to have with the teen. Izuku brought a hand up to his throat and rubbed the flesh there awkwardly, his eyebrows pinched in confusion. Shouta met Yagi's eyes and they shared a subtle moment of concern. The man's face dropped as he undoubtedly made the same realization Shouta had made only a few moments prior. Then, the man shook his head slightly and all traces of earlier concern were gone. He smiled and raised both arms as he stepped further into the room. "I brought breakfast," he said, his voice slightly softer now. Shouta admired the careful way the man held himself, the graceful steps he took as he set the bag down on the nightstand, the way that even now doing something so menial, he was able to command the attention of the room. He was giving Shouta and himself time to collect their thoughts, to formulate a plan and compartmentalize their emotion. Again, the pro found himself feeling grateful for the former number one. "Good. Coffee?" Shouta asked once the bag was set down. Yagi chuckled in response. "Yes, and some tea for you, my boy," he stated, holding the tray over the bed for Shouta to take his drink. Shouta stood and grabbed one of the coffees and Izuku's tea from the tray. He held it out the teen who sat up and took it gratefully, the blankets bunching around his waist, showing off the black sweater he'd borrowed from his teacher earlier. Shouta saw the red and blue of the blanket Yagi had given him and had to suppress the smile threatening to command his features. He wasn't sure if the teen knew, but he was currently cozying up with possibly some one-of-a-kind all-might merch provided by the hero himself. He knew for a fact that if Izuku was aware, he would have refused to use the blanket on principle of keeping it pristine like his other merch. The teen sat up a bit more and wrapped both his hands around the cup, letting out a rumbly sigh as he just held the beverage for a moment. "That should help with your throat, kid." The teen hummed in agreement and took a sip of his tea. Shouta followed his example, taking a sip of his coffee. It took an immense amount of self-control not to immediately spit it out as he realized with dismay that the former number one had gotten him black coffee. Moments like these were when Shouta despised his hard-ass exterior. Moments where people assumed he liked his coffee as black as his clothing. Hisashi drank his coffee black. In fact, he drank straight-up espresso. Shouta, however, did not. He had a sweet tooth that was only satisfied by the quite frankly unhealthy amounts of sugar he took in his coffee, one that somehow no one managed to pick up on despite his food of choice being disgustingly sweet fruit jelly packets. He choked down the black coffee and Yagi shot him a curious glance. Something must have dawned on him, because in the next moment the man was handing over the drink tray that Shouta now noticed had a section of it filled with sugar packets and individual servings of cream. The man himself grabbed 2 of each, dutifully looking away as Shouta grabbed 2 cream and 4 sugar packets. The older man held the tray towards Izuku. "Izuku, would you like any sugar for your—" "What's going to happen to me?" the teen interrupted, destroying the smooth road that the 2 men were relying on to ease tension. The room went silent. Izuku's eyes were tilted downwards, avoiding the looks of the 2 men. He took a shuddering breath and sipped at his tea. His face twisted into something bitter and strangely youthful. I mean, well, I know that my mom did something bad, but she's a good mom. And she really loves me." It almost sounded like a question the way Izuku spoke it, and Shouta felt his blood boil. Yagi looked heartbroken. Izuku continued, "It was probably just like headache pain meds, right? Or maybe sedatives. To help me sleep, right? But Veer, there were too many ... It was an accident, right? Fuck no, kid, no. Quirk suppressants." The teen snapped his head up to stare at Yagi slack-jawed. eyes brimming with unshed tears. Shouda's eyes followed, before darting back to stare at his student. There were a few moments of quiet while both men watched Izuku's eyes dart back and forth as he tried to connect the dots. He jolted and stared at the former number one with wide eyes. "But the quirk?" he asked, and Shouda realized again how behind the teen was in their previous night's discoveries. They weren't suppressing one for all. He interrupted the impromptu staring contest. A look of panic erupted on Izuku's face as he turned to look at his teacher. He squeezed his hand gently. "It's okay, kid. Yagi and the detective told me. I'm not mad at you," were the words that Shouda left unspoken. An expression of relief washed over Izuku's face. Then he slumped over more on the bed. Then he jumped up with a smile, a wild, almost manic look in his eyes. So they didn't work then. I can still use one for all, so that must have meant that they didn't work. No harm, no foul, right? So she didn't actually do anything wrong, right? I mean, suppressants don't even matter when there is nothing to suppress, right? The teen paused when he looked up at his teachers. Something on their faces must have stopped him. "My boy," Yagi startled, reaching over to place a comforting hand on Izuku's arm. His smile fell. "You were never meant to be quirkless." The words seeped into every corner of the room. Words that held a meaning that would uproot Izuku's very life, very being. Shouda didn't fully understand the significance of them. He couldn't, but he could feel the betrayal. He could imagine how they could and would affect the teen before him. He expected crying, that the teen would immediately burst into tears and start wailing, maybe even pass out again from exhaustion. He expected yelling, screaming, anger, and weeping. What he didn't expect was nothing. Izuku, something in his eyes seemed to crack. He just froze. He didn't say a word. His hand fell limp beneath Shouda's. He gave it another squeeze, but it garnered no response. He seemed to barely even breath, like his breath was lodged in his throat. His normally vibrant green eyes now looked more gray than anything, dull and dead. The look sent a spike of panic through Shouda before he felt the hand of the teen twitch beneath his own. He let out an almost unconscious sigh. That relief that Izuku was alive was unfortunately not dulling his current worry at the teen's sullen expression. They gave the teen a few more moments of nothing, hoping maybe that it would hit, that he would start to cry and sob, but that light would come back to his eyes, that he would tell them how he felt, or rather show them, so they could help. Instead, the teen gave them nothing. "You were never meant to be quirkless." What? That couldn't be right. There was no way. Take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in your next life. No, someone without a quirk can't be a hero. Useless Izuku. When are you gonna give up, huh? All this? Are you really even human if you don't have a quirk? Someone like you could never be a hero. Give up already. Oh Izuku, I'm so sorry. A waste of space. A nuisance. Useless. Worthless. Deku was for nothing. He couldn't process it. He just couldn't. Everything was foggy, no blurry. Actually, maybe it wasn't real. That would make more sense. Maybe he was dreaming, or maybe he really had died. Maybe she had killed him. No, he was alive. He could feel the gentle buzz of one for all beneath his skin, feel the power just beneath his fingertips. But it wasn't his, was it? He didn't have one. He didn't have a quirk. He was the quirkless, useless, annoying Deku. Deku kind of sounds like you can do it, don't you think? My Deku isn't always going to mean useless. From now on, Deku is the name of a hero. Everything seemed to contradict itself. You were never meant to be quirkless. You know, Izuku kind of looks like Deku on paper, and that means useless. A useless, worthless, nothing. A Deku. No, all this time, after everything, he had a quirk. Not one for all. Not the one he was given by All Might, but his own quirk. I want you to show the world I am here. Make this quirk your own, young Midoriya. What even was it? Was it like his mom's quirk, telekinesis? Or was it more like his dad's fire-breathing? Wait, no, there was more, there wasn't it? He couldn't quite remember why just fire-breathing felt wrong. After all, that's what his mom told him all these years. I was worried you didn't smell right, but it is you, isn't it, Lil Spark? Oh yeah, his dad was back, and he was a hero. His quirk made him like a dragon. Yes, he remembered. But what about Mama? He must have been deep inside his own head, because he barely registered the presence of the two men in the room even as their hands held onto him. He barely even looked up when he felt another hand come up and brush his hair out of his face. It was only when he felt that same warm, calloused hand cup his cheek and turn his face that the fog around him began to fade. His face was close to his teacher's, to Aizawa sensei. He was squeezing his cheek and talking to him, an unusual softness taking over his usually gruff tone. At first, Izuku couldn't make out what he was saying. He just watched the man's eyes, searching for something neither of them quite knew. The man's face tightened, and his eyes portrayed worry. Izuku was confused. Why was he worried? Was someone hurt? Were they okay? He felt his hand being lifted off of the bed and felt as it was placed against the hero's chest. It was warm, and a soft ba-dum behind the chest brought him further out of the fog. There you go, kid. Aizawa's voice finally seeped through the fog, a certain gentleness that wasn't usually there now showing through. Come back to us now, okay? Can you feel my heartbeat? He nodded against the man's hand. Everything but Aizawa seemed so distant. Good. Focus on that for me, okay? He thought about nodding again, but didn't want to move his head away from the man's warm hand. Instead, he opened his mouth and shut it a couple of times before answering with a soft, "Okay, sensei." Aizawa's eyes positively lit up with that, and he could have sworn he saw a slight uptake in his lips before they dropped back into a neutral expression. "Okay, problem child, can you tell me where we are right now?" he asked Izuku. The question confused him. They were at home, weren't they? He was on a bed. Wait, no, it must have been school. The school infirmary, yeah. No, that wasn't right either, ... and it wasn't the dorms, so then where were they? His chest began to tighten. Hey, no, it's okay. Just follow my breathing, all right, kid? Just keep following me. He'd never heard his teacher sound so soft before. It was confusing but nice. He tried to listen to the man, to match his steadily quickening breaths with the even ones of his teacher as the man kept the fog receding to the edge of his vision. Good job, Izuku, just like that. Can you ... can you try again for me? As his breaths evened, he took another moment to think. He glanced around, at the bed, at the walls, at the IV drip by the bed. Oh, we're at the hospital. He swallowed. Mustafu General Hospital, right? The hero nodded, his eyes crinkling. You brought me here, you and All Might San. This time, the uptake of the man's lips wasn't his imagination. That's right, kid, it's just past 9 am. And you, me, and Yagi were talking about some things. Aizawa seemed hesitant to continue. He glanced away for a moment and something behind Izuku seemed to steal his nerves. Do you remember what we were talking about? Izuku paused again, thinking. The memories trickled in less like a train wreck this time and more like a soft, steady stream, like Aizawa was literally holding his brain from collapsing, letting him process the memories more comfortably. We were talking about what happened to me. The hero nodded, so Izuku continued. You guys just told me that mom that she made me quirkless. He couldn't get the next words out. They felt like glass in his throat, cutting his esophagus and filling his mouth with blood. Suddenly the metaphor became too real as a sudden urge to vomit overwhelmed his system. He wrenched his head away from Aizawa's hand and started gagging, trying to get the phantom taste of blood out of his mouth. He gagged and coughed, feeling as something seemed to pop and dislodge within his throat. He retched more as he felt something slimy and foreign crawling its way up his insides. The phantom sensation became stronger, and to the entire room's horror, bloody splatters began to fly out of Izuku's mouth with each retch. With a violent gag, blood spewed from Izuku's mouth all over the sheets of the bed. Something pinkish red and strangely fleshy came out with it. The sight only made his nausea worse and he forced his eyes shut with a whine. Faintly, he registered the worried voice of Aizawa shouting at someone to get a nurse. All other words faded away as he fought to keep his focus on the firm hand rubbing circles in his back and squeezing the base of his neck reassuringly. He coughed up a couple more strange fleshy bits. Was he dying? He imagined what a horror scene the hospital sheets must have resembled, but he didn't dare open his eyes again. He knew the sight of his own blood would be too much for him and would set off more gagging. The metallic smell clung to his nose, the coppery taste overwhelming everything else. But there was nothing in his throat anymore, nothing phantom or real. He took a few shuddering breaths and leaned back into Aizawa's hand. He felt disgusting. I'm okay, sensei. I'm okay. His teacher let out an unexpected snort but quickly cleared his throat. I'd love to believe you, problem child, but it literally looks like you just vomited your guts out. Forgive me if I'm a tad skeptical. At this, Izuku let out his own snort. His throat felt raw and something in his chest felt weirdly empty. But he didn't feel like he was on the verge of death, he just felt well. Gross. A few moments of quiet followed, every once in a while reassuring words being uttered from Aizawa's mouth. Izuku tried to keep himself listening, but being present was difficult when he still felt his consciousness teetering in and out of that fog. At the moment, it overwhelmed him. He stopped fighting it. He needed to stop thinking about how fucked up his body may have been. A new hand on his back forced a jolt out of the teen. Aizawa shushed him gently with a firm squeeze on his shoulder. He felt so vulnerable with his eyes shut, but he resolutely refused to open them. The hand was strangely cold, abnormally so. It almost felt like Todoroki had touched him with his right hand and sent a trail of frost running down his spine. He shivered at the feeling and tried to zone in on the words being exchanged by the new person and his teacher. He caught only every third word, but based on the words, quirk, rejection, new, lung, and mutations, a pretty picture was not being painted. His quirk was doing this, and he thought breaking bones was bad. His mind wandered back to earlier that night, back to his father. He remembered the shiny black scales, thick tail and the puffs of smoke he'd released from his mouth, the strange ears and sharp canines. His father's quirk was a mutation quirk. one that likely came about slowly and naturally once he'd turned 4. Izuku's hadn't. His body had developed as if he was quirkless this whole time. If he had, or was supposed to have a similar mutation quirk ... then all of his mutations would be coming in now, raging his way through his already developed body, destroying anything it needed to replace, ripping him apart inside and out until his body was right. Fuck, and he'd thought growing pains had hurt. If he was going to grow a tail ... shit, maybe he was just overthinking it. But he swore his tailbone and spine were starting to ache already. And the teeth. No wonder he'd had constant toothaches his whole life. He had a whole other set of them. His mind couldn't seem to decide between freaking out over the likely pain he was about to experience and nerding out over his own quirk and the signs he'd been missing his whole life. A sudden, very urgent question entered his mind. Oh my god, am I going to breathe fire? He was suddenly brutally aware of the silence coating the room. Then, completely shocking everyone including himself, he began to giggle. Oh my fuck, I just coughed out my own fucking lung. What the fuck, haha, of course my quirk is going back and replacing my organs. That's so fucking typical. Haha, oh. He was wheezing now, still hunched over what he now knew was his literal lung. The room was still silent. He felt the sudden urge move he needed to get up. What was that awful ringing? He snapped his eyes open and shot his head up. The first sight to meet his own being the extremely concerned face of his mentor, who was standing in front of the bed with a hand reaching out as if to touch Izuku. He was saying something. Izuku could tell by the movements of his mouth, but he couldn't hear anything. Not anything but that awful ringing. He felt himself crack at the sight of his hero. He jumped forwards, pushing right through the tugging hands of his teacher and the nurse. He gripped All Might's hand and tumbled forwards into him, his giggling faltering and falling into heavy sobs as the arms of his mentor caught him. He heaved in breath after aching breath as he wailed, his body aching in new pains and his emotions tearing at the seams. Nothing to distract him but that horrid ringing and the warmth of his hero. All Might simply held him tightly, despite the snot and tears seeping into his shirt, despite the likely uncomfortable weight of the superpowered teen in his hands. Despite, or maybe because of the fact that he knew his boy was only holding on by a thread. He ran a hand through the teen's tangled green curls. He paused his murmured praises as he felt something hot and wet by Izuku's ear. He lifted his hand and stared at the dark blood in horror. The boy was muttering as he sobbed into his chest, like he couldn't even hear himself. Could he? The quirk is starting with his internal body systems. He briefly heard the nurse explain. He'll likely have heightened hearing, so his body is destroying the redundant and useless pieces, so it can replace them. How long will it take? Aizawa inquired. Toshinori didn't hear the answer. He was too busy trying in vain to comfort his boy. He began to whimper and hiccup little noises. The boy, because that's what he was, just a boy, had never sounded so pained. Is there anything you can do? The former hero asked, his voice shaking almost as much as he was. Aizawa looked at the nurse with a similarly hopeful expression. Toshinori glanced down and saw the man's hands covered in blood. She gave them a regretful look, then dropped her sympathetic gaze to the quivering teen. We can only wait until it passes on its own. The teen sobbed again. Toshinori felt his arms tighten at the sound. Aizawa's gaze dropped to his own hands, his eyes wide, pupils quivering. The former hero resisted the urge to hug his coworker close as well, their kinship growing by the second as they acted as Izuku's caretakers. He looked down at the teen again, his face hidden into his sweater, his green mop of hair almost blending in with the plush fabric. He couldn't imagine the pain his boy must have been in to be making such sounds and be holding him so close without worry. The idea of it being anywhere even close to what he experienced when his own organs were destroyed caused him a violent shiver. The barley, their embers of one for all, stirring deep inside of him as his very core ached to help. Maybe he couldn't hold all of Japan together anymore, but maybe, just maybe, he could keep his boy from falling apart. The next few hours were a blur of motion and a snail's race at the same time. Aizawa had stepped out of the room to catch up the rest of the staff with the teen's situation and check in on the police investigation. Tsukachi had been sending Toshinori frequent updates throughout the night, several of them giving details on the man called Kuraii who claimed to be Izuku's biological father. After his interview with the detective, said man had retreated back to his sister's apartment for what remained of the night. Rather unfortunately, Tsukachi bemoaned, the man was not allowed to see Izuku until they had hardcore proof of the relationship. Toshinori was relatively relieved at that knowledge. Not that he hadn't wanted Izuku to have his father there with him. It was simply that he wasn't sure how to react to seeing him. And with what they'd learned of Izuku's mother, he didn't think he'd be able to trust his successor with anyone new anytime soon. Privately, in the depths of his mind, a small voice argued that the true reason he was grateful for Kurai's absence was that he was worried he was to be replaced. He'd always seen the boy much like a son, and the idea of anything intruding on that brought great sadness and a pang of anger that he was almost certain was entirely misplaced. After all, Izuku having his father was a good thing, yes. It was good, he was certain of that. The idea that Aizawa likely had similar feelings to him in regards to the boy was not unknown to Toshinori. However, he'd trust that man with his and Izuku's lives 1,000 times over, so the idea did not plague him. It actually managed to comfort him somewhat. Knowing that someone he trusted was just as willing to take care of and nurture the boy was something that warmed his heart greatly. There they were, both of them far too close to the ground. His boy's face devoid of color and of life, his body jolting uselessly, and Aizawa's folded hands punched into his heart, forcing it to beat. He heard a sickly crunch and registered faintly that Aizawa was sobbing as he performed the aggressive CPR, muttering almost intelligible begs that the teen stay alive and stay with him. The memory from only a few hours sprung on him painfully. He'd never seen Aizawa so distressed. It had been horrifying to see the usually calm man reduced to such emotion. The whole world had turned upside down within one night. All he was really certain of was that this night had been hell incarnate. He would suffer through 1,000 more battles with all for one if it meant he'd never see Izuku or Aizawa like that ever again. He had been so useless in the moment. He'd tried to tug Aizawa away to help the paramedics get to the teen, but his small form was much too weak to even budge the hero. He'd not even been able to assist in carrying the stretcher. No, he was confined to just watching as the hero fought tooth and nail to save his boy's life. He felt the embers of one for all tug and hiss at him, the quirk itself seeming to keep Izuku alive. If the green lightning that raked over his body at the use of the defibrillator was anything to go by, that was an accurate assumption. Even now, he felt so useless, so weak. Aizawa had been doing most of the heavy lifting despite his obvious need for rest. He hadn't been blind to the traumatic responses the pro seemed to be exhibiting. The way he jolted up out of nowhere at least 12 times throughout that night just to check Izuku's pulse, even just before he left the room, as if it were a habit by now to just take the boy's hand, feel for a pulse and give a slight nod to no one in particular before he had left. It had been confusing, it had been understandable, and it had been heartbreaking to see the paranoia the homeroom teacher was fighting against. Anyone who even dared to imply the man didn't care about his students would receive nothing but disdain from Toshinori. That was certain. All the while, all he could do was hold Izuku. He held the teen as his bedsheets were cleaned and replaced. He held him as the nurse poked and prodded at his ears, wiping away blood and pulling out chunks of skin and flesh with tweezers, setting them in a metal tray to be sent to the lab. There was an absurd amount. And at one point, the pieces seemed to resemble soft fatty tissue rather than what was expected from the ear canal. He tried not to think about what that may have meant, about how the ears were an almost direct route to the brain and how they might have been pulling pieces of dead brain tissue out of his successor's ears. No, he tried not to think about it. He just held his boy close to his chest. At that point, he was unsure if he was more reassuring Izuku or himself. Either way, Izuku didn't seem to mind. Throughout the entire ordeal, the boy had stayed grasping close to him, his whole body limp save for the strong arms wrapping around his mentor. He'd continually been letting out small whines and whimpers, even seeming to pant occasionally as the flesh was removed from his ears. The entire time, the boy kept his eyes pressed tightly closed, the stream of steady tears decorating his face, a familiar but heartbreaking sight. The tears themselves clued them in on the next change from Izuku's quirk, instead of just salty water leaking from his tears ducts. As time went on, the tears began to thicken and seep from his whole eyelid rather than just the corners. A slow and steady drawl of a sort of watery goo that smeared onto Toshinori's shirt before anyone had noticed. He paid the stain nearly no mind and with gentle hands tugged the boy's face slightly away from smothering himself in his sweater. His forehead glistened with sweat, and he huffed out a heaving breath as his head was leaned back and examined by his mentor. By that point, the nurse had moved on from his ears, content that he'd removed all of the dead tissue and was sending the metal tray away with another nurse. Toshinori glanced at the now ajar door and saw Aizawa standing outside of it, leaning against the wall with his fingers flying across his phone screen. A pinched expression that could be mistaken as simple annoyance brushed across his features. He looked about as exhausted as Toshinori felt. He turned his attention away from the pro and back to the shivering boy in his arms, his face still cradled in his hands, one petting upwards to scratch at the teen's scalp. The boy let out a groan and leaned into the touch, eyes still pressed shut, the liquid from his eyes now taking on a ruddy yellow with bits of red. The nurse had a pitying expression on his face. He stood and left the two together on the hospital bed. He heard the sound of running water, and before long the man had come back with a small bowl filled with warm water and a damp cloth. The nurse offered the cloth to Toshinori, and he took it graciously before bringing his complete attention back to Izuku. He ran his free hand through the green hair and let out a deep breath, his thin fingers untangling a knot with patient care. "Izuku, my boy, can you hear me?" The teen let out a high simpering whine and slammed both of his hands onto his ears, effectively stopping his tight grip on his mentor but still melting into his touch. He nodded his head minutely, then let out a whimper before trying to tuck his face back into Toshinori's sweater. He held the boy's cheek firmly and began to wipe away the ruddy yellowish pus that seeped from his left eye. It hurts. The two words trailed off into another moan of pain. He couldn't help the slight smile cracking his features. Those were the first words the boy had muttered in over an hour. They weren't much, but he was grateful for anything. He again scratched the boy's scalp and switched to wiping the space under the right eye. The pus here had red tints in it instead of just the yellow. He forced himself to ignore the curling in what was left of his stomach and started to hum what he hoped was a soothing tune. "You are doing so well, my sweet boy, just keep being strong, okay?" The teen nodded again, and the former hero felt his eyes crinkled before his smile fell once more. It was strange. He hadn't realized how taxing the simple act of smiling had been until he no longer had to worry about his persona. He hadn't realized how much brighter and more natural his smiles became when they weren't something plastered on his face 24/7. Yet another way his time as All Might continued to slip away from him. Damn it. He pulled away again and continued to wipe the seeping pus and blood from both eyes, taking care to get close enough to his eyes to properly clean him but trying to make sure he kept them from becoming even more irritated. The flow had begun to slow and Toshinori couldn't help his sigh of relief as the liquid became thinner and less opaque, the small amount mixing with the tears and allowing Toshinori to wipe them away without further skin agitation. The nurse cleared his throat at the sight and moved back towards the teen, two nylon gloves snapping over his hands. "Hello Izuku, I'm here to help you," the nurse started, his voice taking on a soft but bright tone. "Can you open your eyes and turn to me please? If you can't see right now, that's perfectly alright." Izuku nodded and moved slightly away from Toshinori's grip. The former hero moved back as well, leaving one hand resting in Izuku's hair so the teen knew he hadn't left. He stood by the nurse and watched Izuku's face tense as he tried to pry his eyelids open. The boy's hands were still firmly planted over his ears, so the fact that he still seemed to understand them perfectly clearly showed Toshinori that the boy's hearing must have improved. He winced at the idea of the teen interacting with Bakugo like this or most of his classmates rather than he quickly swept away the idea. Right now, they had to take things one crisis at a time. Besides, maybe Shaoji or Jiru would have tips to help him get used to the new onslaught of senses once they were able to explain away this new quirk at least. Shit, how had that slipped his mind? There was no way anyone would buy the excuse that this was just a new manifestation of superpower. That would have been a ridiculous notion to even the dullest of people. He grabbed those worries and shoved them deep into his mind. He knew he would have to confront these worries soon, likely far sooner than he wanted to. For now, however, Izuku needed him, and he needed to put his full attention and care towards making sure his boy was safe and protected. He scratched at the teen's scalp again and the boy relaxed ever so slightly at the gesture. He let out a shaking exhale, more whimper than anything, and slowly began to pry his eyes open. When his eyelids finally slid away, Toshinori couldn't stop the violent nausea that slammed into him. Izuku's irises and pupils were almost completely gone. It was like they had melted out of his eye sockets. A thin-looking membrane was slid over the gap where the center of his eye had been, and a strange fluid seemed to be building up behind them that resembled the fluid of a green glow stick. He barely resisted the urge to gag. Izuku's breath hitched. I can't see. I can't see, All Might, I can't." "Where are you?" the teen gasped as Toshinori cupped his cheek, his own breath hitching while he held his boy. "Shhh, my boy, it's all right. I'm right here, I am right here." His eyes were suspiciously wet and he had to consciously force his breathing into submission rather than the full-blown panic attack trying to overtake him. "All right, Izuku," the nurse continued. "It looks like everything is going smoothly. Could you lean your head back for me, kid? I'm going to give some eye drops. Your vision should be back within the hour." Toshinori jumped up, a jolt of excitement rushing through him. Really? That soon? He was shot a dampening glare, causing a sheepish smile to present on his face. Yes, his internal mutations are developing at an alarming but consistent speed. It's likely your body has been preparing for them for a long time. Byaosu-san used his quirk to flush the rest of the drugs out of your system and must have kick-started them, he explained, one gloved hand holding Izuku's chin slightly elevated, the other administering the eye drops. "Now blink for me, please." Izuku complied, then let the lids fall again with a satisfied sigh. These eye drops are enhanced by a regeneration quirk and should help speed along the process. He gave what he hoped came across as a grateful smile before he returned all of his focus onto Izuku. He was still trembling, but his breaths were coming easier. The shaking in his chest had diminished. Everything was loud, so loud. But he was able to manage it now. He was already getting used to the constant new stimulus his ears were filling him with. It was exciting, it was terrifying. And it hurt. His eyes, he meant. They were stinging, and there was a persistent pressure behind his eyelids and going deep into his head. All he had seen when he opened his eyes was blinding white light, and he was almost ashamed of how quickly he'd panicked. He'd completely forgotten about the hand on his head and immediately stressed about the location of his mentor. The sense of relief when he heard his voice and felt his hands again was almost as relieving as the news that his sight would be back within the hour. He wondered what everything would look like. Would his eyesight be sharper? Would he be able to see farther? Maybe his eyes had even developed new color receptors and he'd be able to see completely unique colors. Would he be able to see different waves of light? Would he be able to see heat signatures like infrared vision? He was oh so curious and was rifling through any and all information he had on the eyesight of lizards and cold-blooded creatures, which thanks to his proneness to fall into deep internet dives was a decently large amount. There was also the chance that his eyesight wouldn't resemble that of any normal cold-blooded lizard or that it was some sort of unique mixture. After all, it was a quirk based on the physiology of a dragon, a fictional, mythological beast. Would his eyes be the same color? Would his pupils look the same? Would they? His mental tangent was interrupted by the booming laugh of All Might and a heavy clap on the shoulder. He couldn't help the large flinch and wince at the louder-than-usual laugh and sudden extra contact. Thankfully, All Might seemed to notice, and the hand on his shoulder gave a firm squeeze. "Oh my boy, it's nice to hear you muttering like your usual self." His face heated up, blood rushing to his head at an alarming speed. "Oh shit, I said all that out loud, didn't I?" Another booming laugh, and he promptly slapped a hand over his mouth. "Yes, Izuku, you did say all that out loud." He could practically hear the smile in the man's voice, and he felt a weary grin tug at his own lips. The hand on his shoulder traveled inwards and started to rub small circles into his lower neck and upper back, the gentle warm pressure helping to further relax his body. He hummed into it and was surprised when the hum came out lower and more growly than expected. The sound rumbled inside of him and sent a pleasant vibrating sensation throughout his entire body, allowing waves of calm buzzing to ease his nerves and aching muscles. The rubbing hand sent his memory back to his earlier episode, where instead of the larger-than-life hands spanning a large amount of his shoulder blades, it was his teacher's regular-sized calloused hands that tried to ease him through his panic. Where was he now? Was he still in the room with them and just keeping silent? No, he wasn't in the room. Izuku was certain that it was currently just him, All Might, and the nice nurse. He'd always had a knack for knowing who was in the room with him, and as he paid closer attention, he realized that most of his gut feelings had actually stemmed from vague odors he picked up around the room. Was this a part of his quirk? He'd never thought too deeply into it before, but now it seemed like he was questioning everything. Was he angry with Izuku for getting so emotional? Or maybe he'd gone back to the dorms to take care of his classmates. Maybe he had. Patrol. He wasn't quite sure of the time anymore, and he wouldn't have been too shocked if most of the day had already passed. He got like that when he was emotional, losing track of time and allowing it to slip past him in large, unrecognizable chunks of amnesia. "Is his Aizawa-sensei here?" He felt himself ask before he had actually made up his mind on if he would. The hand pressed more firmly and All Might began to chuckle beside him. "He's just in the hall, my boy. Nedzu needed an update, and I'm sure your friends have been worried sick and pestering him." It felt like a bolt of lightning ripped through him. A sudden flash of blonde, explosions, the faint scent of caramel. "Oh God, All Might." He jolted upwards, unbeknownst to him only barely avoiding smacking All Might in the face as he reached around and grasped at the man desperately. "Izuku, what is it?" The teen's response breathed a healthy dose of fear into both of their hearts. "Ka-chan." All Might's hand stilled on his back as a thick fog of tension layered over the room. "We were supposed to spar tonight, or well, last night after I got back from my mom's." He brought his hands together in front of him, mindlessly picking at his nails. I can't believe I missed sparring with Ka-chan." There was a long pause, and Izuku heard the man suck in a breath. The hand on his back twitched. "My boy," All Might started. "I don't think he's going to be so mad." Izuku couldn't stop himself from interrupting. Everything but his own thoughts seemed so disconnected. We just started to fix things, and now I ruined it." The room fell into silence again. He felt an aching sob build up in his throat. It came out as a pathetic-sounding cry, and he began to fold in on himself. He and All Might were sitting on the hospital bed, side by side. Izuku's legs were dangling off the bed, swinging aimlessly. In a flurry of movement, he brought his knees up to his chest and hugged them inwards, tiny sobs shaking his body. He could feel the man's body heat right next to him, and he felt the sudden urge to just bury himself in it. He found himself leaning into his mentor's side, the hand on his back reaching to tuck itself around his shoulders, pulling him closer. He felt another sob tumble out of his throat and tucked his head into All Might's side. With his arm planted firmly around Izuku, his hero held him close as he cried. The tears at this point mostly used up from the sheer amount of fluids he'd lost. There was an awkward shuffling on the bed before his mentor uttered a small thank you to someone other than Izuku. It was only a moment later that he felt something small and plastic being pressed against his lips. He parted them and began to suck up the water greedily through the straw, not realizing how thirsty he was until the cool liquid pressed against his dry tongue. The motions of drinking felt strangely foreign to him, his tongue wrapping awkwardly around the straw, but he adapted swiftly, drinking as much as he could before the straw made a loud slurping noise against the bottom of the empty bottle. He let out a sigh of relief and let his head fall into All Might's chest. the soft rises and falls of the man's chest helping to further calm him. After a few more moments of quiet, he felt the man adjust slightly against his side, one of his hands making a home in Izuku's curls. "Izuku, my boy, you haven't ruined anything, okay?" He nodded against his hero's side, not really believing him. All Might seemed to pick his hesitancy up and continued to speak, his fingers tracing soft circles along his upper arm in almost mindless patterns. "Young Bakugo will surely understand why you were unable to spar with him. I believe he's more worried about your well-being than anything." The hand around his shoulders gave him a firm squeeze, forcing a strained laugh past Izuku's lips. Kachin, worried. The notion seemed ridiculous. He couldn't imagine the teen being worried about anyone, let alone about him. Again, All Might seemed to understand the words left unspoken as the arm around Izuku tightened and the man let out a weary sigh. "Bakugo Shounen cares about you, Izuku. That's why he wants to spar with you." His tone left no room for argument. And honestly, Izuku didn't think he could have argued with that even if he wanted to. Kachin didn't do things if he didn't want to. If he hated Izuku and didn't care about him, there was no way he'd be willing to spar with him twice a week. There was no way he'd even remotely indulge his murmured rambles. No way he'd be okay with Izuku joining in on his study sessions or allow him to be dragged to weekly movie nights with the rest of the class. There was no way he didn't care whenever he made katsuden. He always accidentally made too much and demanded that Izuku have it so it wouldn't go to some extra who couldn't handle the spice because he knew that Izuku's spice tolerance rivaled his own. He knew that Kachin cared, because of course Izuku knew. He knew Kachin. He knew that whatever their relationship was, it wasn't a hateful one, at least not anymore. Maybe it had been at one point, but those times had passed and he'd grown so much since then. They both had. So sure, he couldn't imagine Kachin sitting around worrying about him like a normal person, but he could accept the fact that the Explosion Quirk teen did care. And maybe, just maybe, he was being just a tad dramatic in the reaction he expected from his friend. He wasn't sure how to respond to All Might's words. His feelings were so complicated that he was certain if he tried to speak on it, all that would come out would be word vomit. So instead of speaking, he just nodded his head before sinking deeper into All Might's side, reveling in the warmth the man gave off. He smelled faintly of pine, likely a cologne, and Izuku soaked in the scent of it. Something about it was so fitting of his hero. There was a faint coppery smell as well, though he wasn't sure if that was a remnant of the blood he himself lost or if it was a scent that always permeated the former number one. He leaned towards the latter, as this specific scent of copper seemed strangely dissimilar to that of his own. He couldn't pinpoint the difference other than picking up on the fact that it was just plain different. It was strange. He wasn't sure if these smells had always been there and he just hadn't noticed or picked up on them, or if they were some new mutation of his quirk. Nothing about it felt new though. It didn't feel strange or out of place. The intensity of it wasn't different to what he remembered before. It was just now he was noticing it more, picking up on the oddities that he would have brushed off a day ago. Kachin smelled sweet, like caramel, one of the bonuses that came with sweating nitroglycerin. Could other people smell that? Could they predict the size of the explosion based on the intensity of the smell? Could he only do that because he had known the other boys so long and been on the receiving end of so many explosions? Or was it a facet of his quirk he'd always had but hadn't noticed? Was it a mixture of both? Had he picked up on other people's scents? Was it weird if he did? Aizawa-sensei smelled like coffee, but that was surely expected. Everyone noticed that, right? He smelled like coffee and his cologne smells like the bourbon his mom once let him try a sip of, the smell much better than the taste. Then there was Ada. He smelled like orange juice and smoke, car exhaust smoke. It wasn't intense or unpleasant, but it was an obvious smell that Izuku now associated with his friend. Uraraka smelled faintly of sweat and more strongly of strawberries, courtesy of the flavored chapstick she swore by. Again, he found neither smells unpleasant. They were just specifically a part of her scent. Was that normal? Was he maybe more in tune with people's pheromones? Then again, maybe he was just weird. Once he had his phone again and his sight, he would need to do some more research into mutation quirks. He could already fill a full notebook just with the questions he had. If he wanted to document the answers, which he did, it was going to take lots of time and research and at least 3 more notebooks. And again, it would require his sight. Speaking of his sight, he wasn't sure how long it had been since the nurse had given him the eye drops. Maybe he should try opening his eyes again. Surely he would be all better now. He almost tried. He could feel his eyelids begin to twitch, but then he stopped himself. The idea of seeing just that bright white again made him tremble. He wasn't ready to risk it yet. He pressed his eyelids shut just a tad more forcefully and let out a long, slow exhale, a warm feeling climbing his throat and expelling with the breath. He felt All Might's arm tighten minutely and the man inhaled a touch more aggressively than before. Before Izuku could ask about it, a soft scratch at his scalp had him humming in satisfaction, his thoughts seeping away from him, leaving him feeling like his mind was wading through molasses. Maybe he'd take a quick nap, while he was free of pain and empty of tears. Yeah, a nap would be nice. He should have known better than to think this could all fly under the radar. He should have remembered that the media was a force to be reckoned with, that there was always someone watching. In the heat of it all, he had forgotten. And now he was stuck picking up the pieces. Someone had leaked a picture. He wasn't sure who or how they got it. But circling the internet was a picture of Izuku, laid out on a stretcher being ushered into the ambulance with a black-clothed figure with a white scarf on top of him. The picture was taken from a distance, but close enough to make out the face of Izuku. It must have been someone in one of the other apartments. They must have heard the commotion and snapped a photo without anyone noticing. It was all speculation right now. Not one article seemed to clue into the actual situation, but that didn't stop the headlines. U.S. student attacked in own home. Class 1A's tragic 3RD attack. Casualties unknown. Is the league still at large? We think so. More and more articles along the same vein kept popping up. It was a mess, and even worse than just the vultures of the media seeing the photo. His Hell class had found it as well. He and Mike had been stuck on damage control for the class while Netsu and some members of the police force tried to get the articles taken down or at least censored. From what he'd seen, they hadn't had much luck. While it was nice to see the kids so concerned for one of their classmates, Shouta honestly just wanted to hide in his sleeping bag and cry. God, he was so fucking tired. He scrolled up in the class chat to find the beginnings of today's chaos, which seemed to have started around 40 minutes ago. Problem children. Walmart Pikachu. Whoa guys. Ava, you seen this? Is Midabro okay? He doesn't elk look okay. HTTPS. Divided by you a student had a kid known home. Divided by you updates divided by 297,369. Basic all a god. Oh dear. Is that Aizawa sensei and All Might sensei as well? That cannot be good. Has anyone spoken to Midoriya-kun? Walmart Pikachu. Shit yeah, that is Aizawa. MIDOBROT. At bonus snapped YOJUJBGOOD. Curbabucutor. Wasn't Deku supposed to be here last night? That's in top actually him right. Clasper Z. Midoriya-kun was visiting his mother for dinner last night. Although I assumed he had just come back late as I never heard him return at Glitter Queen at Prince of Darkness did either. Of you see Midoriya in the dorms. Lord Explosion. The nerd didn't come back last night. Clasper Z. Bakugo. Are you certain? Glitter Queen. The loud one is correct. Monami, our dear friend, was not here yesterday evening. Prince of Darkness. His brightness did not grace our floor last night. However, Dark Shadow saw Sensei leaving the dorms in a hurry late evening. Prince of Darkness, I fear that whatever darkness haunts that image is not something that has been fabricated. Rainy Hero, I saw him leave the dorms as well. Kiro, he ran all the way to the gates. Living Boulder, then that means he must be with Midabro, right? If Sensei is with him, then he has to be alright. Aizawa is too manly to let anything happen to our bro. White Powder Addict, I mean it's Midoriya. Mr. I'm gonna break all my bones butyl so be thebid guy. He's got to be fine. He's one of the toughest dudes we know. Mike Sensei, hey dudes, just letting you listeners know that Midoriya is a-okay. Thumbs up, Aizawa and All Might are with him at Mustafu General right now. Thumbs up. God fucking damn it, Hisashi, why couldn't you leave that last part out? Curbabucutor, Dekukun's in the hospital. What HAPPNEDMDMJ? Walmart Pikachu. Wait, so the pic was Rilal. Oi JUDHUNJN. MIC Sensei WHTH8 penned. At Basic all a god. While I disagree with your Uraka and Kaminari's approach, I too must ask what occurred. Clasper Z. Yes, that picture looked serious. It appeared that Aizawa sensei was giving Midoriya chest compressions. Was there a villain attack, sensei? Was anyone else injured? Rainy Hero. Was it the league again, sensei? They seem to have it out for Midoriya. Mike sensei. Again, listeners, right now Midoriya is alright. There was an incident at his apartment last night that's considered sensitive information, but I can confirm that this was not the result of a villain attack, and the articles have zero clue what they are talking about. Capiche? Lord Explosion. The fuck you mean it wasn't a villain attack? Deku's in the fucking hospital. Living Boulder. Hey you man, don't swear at Mike sensei. Still though, I agree with Bekubro. How was it not a villain attack? Mike sensei. Sorry kiddos, but I really am not in the place to share that information. Just know that Midoriya is safe and that this wasn't another directed villain attack. Try to relax and enjoy your sad listeners. After a few minutes of silence in the chat, another message from Hisashi came through. Like sensei, okay, Todoroki has just reminded me of something very important. As if right now, UA needs all of you kiddos to stay on campus so we can sort this press stuff out so all permissions to leave school grounds are temporarily revoked. Sorry, Curbabucutor. Wait, Todoroki at Isahat, you wanted to leave campus? I thought you hated heading home. Isahat, I do. Curbabucutor, so why did you want to go home? Isahat, I don't. Living Boulder, I'm extremely confused right now. Isahat, why? Prince of Darkness, I believe I understand what's happening here. Isahat, there's not much to understand. Isahat, unless you are willing to cover for me. Rainy Hero, I think he wants to visit Midoriya. Kurbabucutor, that's a great idea. We should all go visit Deku-kun. Habo-sensei, Midoriya is not allowed any visitors. Kurbabucutor, SENSEI. Is DEKUKUN okay? Habo-sensei, yes. Don't blow up his phone too much, I'm pretty sure. It's dead and he needs time to recover. Aizawa, what happened? He paused at that. While Hisashi could get away with saying he couldn't share the answers, he was pretty sure his students wouldn't accept the same response from him. He took a deep breath and began to mentally formulate a response before he received a message from an unsaved number. Unknown, what the fuck happened to Deku? Moments after, several more messages flooded in from the same number. Unknown, the hag saw an ambulance outside of his apartment, and Inko won't respond to her. Deku won't respond to me. He always fucking responds. Unknown, and don't bullshit me like Mike did. I'm not stupid. He looked fucking dead in that photo. Unknown, if the nerd is dead, I'm going to fucking kill him. Unknown, answer me, old man. Bakugo. Fuck. Shouta saved Bakugo's number swiftly, then pressed his eyes shut, a hand coming up to rub at his head almost feverishly. There was a building migraine starting behind his eyes that he was trying to force away. He took a long sip of water and paused where he was, eyes still shut, reveling in the blanket of darkness that eased his aching head. The hallway was decently empty, it had been for a while. If he was being smarter, he would have found an empty office like Tsukachi had. Unfortunately for his rational brain, his worry for Izuku hadn't allowed him to go further than the hall just outside his room. It helped that they were in a secluded corner of the hospital, and with the time spent hovering outside of the room, he got a decent idea of what nurses worked this area, and the ones that would be in and out of Izuku's room the most. He occasionally stopped them for updates, not wanting to intrude on the interactions between All Might and his successor more than he had to. So far, Izuku's lungs, esophagus, vocal cords, eardrums, cochlea, parts of unidentified brain tissue, and the central area of his eyes had been the victims of his quirk's rampaging evolution. He should have been in immense pain, and the nurses were certain that he was at least experiencing some. But judging from the confused looks they had shared, it was to a far lesser extent than expected. One nurse remarked that possibly the pain center of his brain was being affected as well. Another believed he had simply gone into shock, while a third wondered if there had been some brain damage during his cardiac arrest they hadn't noticed previously. Shouta privately believed that his student was just numb from the pain of breaking his limbs over and over again. That while he was in pain, he was used to working through it and fighting against it. There was no tangible proof either way, and Izuku's condition was too unpredictable for them to put him through the proper scans and tests they could use to figure it out. At least at this point, his transformations seemed to be settling down. He'd fallen asleep on Yagi, and while sleeping, the nurses had checked on his eyes. They seemed to be, at least on a surface level, fully functional. They would have to take him to an optometrist to be certain, but his irises and pupils now resembled those of a cat, a reflective tapetum even shining behind his pupils that he just knew Izuku would nerd out over once he woke up. The forest green of them had changed in hue as well, taking on a more neon coloring that resembled the color of the lighting that rumbled around Izuku when he used One for All. Yagi had beckoned him into the room as the nurses left, his posture wound tight but still smiling nonetheless. Shouta grimaced once he caught sight of Yagi's shirt, the front of it covered in gross-looking stains of pus and blood and God knows what else. Izuku, none the wiser to any changes in the room's occupancy, was snoring softly under the sheets, the snores rumbling out of him in growls that sounded almost like purring if he was being honest. Shouta was beyond relieved to see him so relaxed and at this moment lacking any sort of pain. It lifted a heavy weight off of his chest, and he took what felt like his first full breath in hours. He reached and gave the teen's hand a squeeze, checking the pulse once more, a habit at this point. Yagi gave him a knowing sort of look that had Shouta's face falling into a scowl. The former hero was unfazed. Yagi glanced down at his shirt and his face twisted, skin growing pale. "You don't happen to have a spare shirt, do you, Aizawa-kun?" Shouta's scowl dropped, and he let out a broken chuckle at the former hero's pleading tone. He tentatively sat down on Izuku's left, the chair he slept in still posed beside the bed. The chuckle quickly caught in his throat as he felt his phone buzz in his hand again. Undoubtedly more questions from his students. If he hadn't been so exhausted, he might have remembered that Bakugo and Izuku's mother were friends, that they lived in the same neighborhood too. He might have been able to prepare, been able to mitigate the damage. But in his exhaustion, that fact had evaded him. Of course she would have seen all the commotion and told her son when her friend wouldn't answer her. Of course that was his luck. Shit, he knew he couldn't get away with giving the kid a half-assed answer, but he really couldn't see what else he could do besides just giving in and telling him the truth. If Bakugo suspected anything was missing from his response, he wouldn't put it past the explosion quirk teen to bully Mike into giving him a better answer. As much as he loved Hisashi, he didn't trust his husband to hold his ground against a worried Bakugo. Izuku and Bakugo always had a strange relationship that no one could ever quite understand. Sure, some things were clear. They had been childhood friends at one point, and sometime later down the line that friendship had turned into bully and victim. Now it seemed to have gone back towards a tentative friendship, a rivalry really. The two shared a determination like no other, and if Shouta was a betting man, he would place a substantial amount of money on those two taking spots in the top 10. They were some of his most promising students. They were also the students that caused him some of the most headache. It hit him suddenly that even if he didn't fully understand the teens' relationship, possibly the one man who did other the teens themselves was sitting in the chair across from him. All Mike knew, Yagi understood them more than any of the other teachers had. He was faintly aware that the man in question was giving him an odd look. He ignored it and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was a tense moment of silence before he spoke. Bakugo messaged me. Yagi's breath hitched. The man pressed his eyes shut and took what looked like a deep, forceful breath. What did you tell him? He asked. Nothing. He won't believe any half-assed response, and I don't know how to give him a decent one. The older man sighed and ran a hand through Izuku's hair. The teen leaned into the touch with a satisfied hum. The hand Shouta still held, giving a comforting squeeze even in his sleep. He knows. A pause. Then another sigh. About one for all I mean. Izuku told him the first day of foundational heroics. He can't keep a secret from young Bakugo to save his life. The boy didn't believe him at first. Naturally, it's insane even to me. Shouta interjected, a hazy sort of anger squeezing his vision. I'm still angry I wasn't informed earlier. I could have helped. Yaga's face took on a shameful expression, the hand in Izuku's hair stilling. Why yes, I understand that now. I should have told you. I am truly sorry. The sincerity in his tone had Shouta pausing, taking a moment as the anger cleared to look at the man, really look at him. Then he looked at Izuku, an aggressive wave of protectiveness flowing through him. It's not important now, Shouta decided. Decisions were made and all that's done is done. He paused again, brows pinched in thought. What should I tell him? The truth, Yagi answered almost immediately before his face reddened and he brought his hands up to gesture widely. Or at least part of it. Until young Izuku can tell him the rest. I don't know for certain, but his hands dropped and his tone turned serious again. But I think Izuku and I are both tired of keeping secrets. Shouta let out a small hum of agreement, allowing his mind a moment to ponder. I'll tell him the gist of it. I won't specify anything about the drug itself or about Izuku's mother. He decided. It was unlikely they would be able to keep the truth at bay for long. However, Izuku deserved to have at least a little peace until then. Yagi hummed, one of his hands reaching up to rub at his neck. That's for the best. This isn't the sort of news that should be broken over text. We can see about telling him more once young Izuku wakes up. I'm sure he'll want to go about this in his own way. They both stopped to look at the teen again, sharing a quiet moment. Shouta reached forwards and almost absent-mindedly thumbed away a bit of drool on Izuku's face, a fond upturn of the lips fighting his neutral expression. Problem child, he murmured, unable to keep the quiet fondness from his tone. He and Yagi shared one final look before Shouta settled back into his seat, phone screen unlocked and eyes glued to the open chat. He took a breath and typed out a message. Shouta Aizawa, Izuku is alive. Last night he went into cardiac arrest as a result of a drug overdose. He is currently recovering from the side effects of the drug. There, keep it short and simple and hope to minimize confusion. No lies but no specifics either. Bakugo Katsuki, the nerd, tried to kill himself. Oh no. Fuck. Aizawa-kun, is everything alright? Yagi asked. Shouta kept his eyes glued to the screen, fingers frozen. Bakugo Katsuki, why would he do that? What the fuck? Why? Bakugo Katsuki, I'm coming there now. I don't give a shit what UA wants. I don't care. I'm coming now. Even through the text, Shouta could feel Bakugo's panic. He could feel it because he was sure it was identical to the panic he experienced when he first saw Izuku dead on his couch. Without thinking much more past the need to reassure his student, he reached up and pressed the call button. The kid answered immediately. Katsuki, he breathed, using the teen's given name without thinking. His only response was heavy huffing from the other line. Yagi's eyes were wide. Shouta ignored him and stood up, booking it back towards the hallway. He just didn't want to wake Izuku. Don't fucking call me that. Mike said Mustafu General. Yeah, that's the closest to his mom's. I'm fucking coming. Tell the nerd I'm coming. Okay. Katsuki, Izuku is okay. He interrupted, hoping the continued use of his given name would show the kid his sincerity and seriousness. His reassurance did not work. The heavy breathing over the phone only became louder, thick sobs audible through the speaker. Sounds he didn't know the kid was capable of making. No fuck he's not. He fucking overdosed. He tried to shout. I couldn't let him finish that sentence. Not only was it wrong, but the surety of Bakugo's voice filled Shouta with dread. He didn't jump to that conclusion based on only the information Shouta gave him. Katsuki jumped to that conclusion based on experience. This was not a suicide attempt. He poured every ounce of sincerity he held into that one sentence, praying that the teen heard it in his voice. Izuku did not know he was being drugged. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the speaker. Shouta's heart rate spiked. Please kid, just stay put. I'll get Mike to drive you over here and you can see for yourself and I can explain more, but I swear I will expel you if you try to leave UA without an escort. Who? He paused. Bakugo's voice was calm now, the words so quiet it was more breathed than spoken. Get Hisashi Mike, I mean. He'll escort you. Who drugged him? Another pause. And a well-deserved sigh pushed its way past his lips. I can't tell you that, kid, he murmured. Not now, not yet. He rubbed at his eyes, suppressing a groan. I'll kill whoever did it. Another pause. Fucking hell, kid, I want to as well. That's why I need you to get Mike. He spoke softly, ignoring his own bloodlust. There's a lot to explain that I cannot share over the phone. This pause was longer than the others. The usual calmness that he felt in quiet moments completely evaded him as he waited for the teen's response, his head now pounding in distress. Damn it, where did he put his eye drops again? Fine, I'm going. He breathed out a sigh of relief. Keep me on the line. That way Mike won't give you a hard time. There was an affirmative grunt, then the slight sound of movement while Bakugo went to find Hisashi. He took the time to take several deep, calming breaths. Yagi poked his head out of the doorway, his face mottled with concern. Hisashi's bringing Bakugo. He didn't elaborate further. Yagi either understood or simply deemed further questions of lesser importance. He nodded and Shouta let out what was, at this point, probably his 50th sigh in the past 20 minutes. He'd messed up bad. He hadn't even thought about the possibility of Bakugo coming to that conclusion, which, in hindsight, was stupid when that was his first worry as well. But God, the sureness in Bakugo's tone. It was like he was certain that Izuku had done it, like he had been almost expecting it. Shit, he was going to have to talk to him about it. He just wanted to go to bed. He couldn't believe he didn't expect this. Standing there in the hallway outside of Izuku's room, face pressed into his hands, listening to the quickened steps of Bakugo on the other line as he went to find Hisashi. Shouta felt like such an idiot. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally in a way that hadn't plagued him in years. He'd come close to crashing after the USJ, then again after the training camp and All Might's retirement. It was only now that he was considering how much the past 2 days had truly affected him he felt he was about to snap. He could see the headline now, Eraserhead, dead at 31, cause of death, being emotionally vulnerable, taking into account all the other ways he'd almost died. The idea of death via emotions was absolutely the worst. It didn't take long for Bakugo to reach Hisashi, and it took even less time to convince his husband to drive them both to the hospital. The conversation layered over Shouta's mind in a muggy haze. He spoke like normal, gave proper instructions and responded calmly, but the entire thing was a blur he was barely conscious of. He felt his hand twitch with the sudden urge to check Izuku's pulse again, a spike of panic jolting through him. He let out a couple of deep calming breaths and forced his body to relax. Izuku was fine. He could hear the boy's snores from where he was in the hall. He was fine. Hisashi was probably worried about him. He knew that his clipped answers through the speaker had been lacking at best. Even just the sound of his husband's voice had him feeling like he was about to break down. He hadn't felt this jittery and on edge in years. It was horrible. Maybe it was caffeine withdrawal. His almost untouched coffee was still on the nightstand of Izuku's room. Or maybe it was the sneaking familiarity of it all. Memories of green curls blending into light blue wisps, violent CPR, empty pulses, flashing lights, paramedics and sirens. That childlike voice begging the teen below him to stay alive as the ribs crunched inward, sobs dragging their way out of his wrecked throat, eyes screaming in pain. No. No, please don't leave me. Don't you dare. Please, Oboro, just stay with me, okay? Just stay. Yeah, that was definitely it. He needed a nap. He needed to get his coffee and he needed his husband like yesterday. Thoughts of Hisashi brought his mind swirling back to rationality, away from the sensitive triggers he'd left untouched for all of 15 years. They were meant to have the night in together. After Shouta was done marking essays and Hisashi's radio show had ended, it was going to be their first night to themselves in over a week. Damn it, he hadn't had the time to even cancel. He was so caught up in everything. Hisashi must have been worried sick. He never made it home last night and he never even bothered to text him. Sure, there had been objectively more important things going on and Nedzu would have kept all of the teachers updated. But still, that didn't stop Shouta from feeling like a piece of shit. That feeling only increased when he finally got sight of his husband not 20 minutes later. His hair frizzy and pulled into a loose bun, his eye bags pronounced, face free of the usual makeup he wore to conceal them. He'd foregone wearing his hero suit and was instead dressed in what Shouta could only describe as panicked casual. He was wearing a t-shirt with a cat curled up on the chest and a pair of pink lounge pants Shouta was certain were his. This outfit was haphazardly pulled together by one of Hisashi's leather jackets that somehow managed to make the basically pajamas into an acceptable bit of day wear. The stab of guilt that snapped at him was quickly shoved away in favor of melting into the embrace Hisashi wrapped him in, his husband cooing at him in soft tones, running a hand through his hair in that way that made him melt further. He was okay. Hisashi was here, so he was okay. He could actually feel his blood pressure lower to a normal level. his breaths coming evenly. He hadn't even realized they had been uneven in the first place. God, he was so tired. It took him several moments to gather himself enough to even open his eyes. He was shaking, tugging tightly at Hisashi's shoulders. It took him a few moments to even acknowledge the other guest Hisashi brought along. Glancing over the man's shoulder, his view was quickly greeted by a very awkward-looking Bakugo standing with his hands in his pockets, gaze pointedly averting itself away from his teachers. The teen didn't look much better than Hisashi. While his clothes were completely normal and put together, his face was pinker than usual, red rings stood out pronounced around his eyes, and his hair was significantly flatter than what was normal. In short, compared to his usual standards, Bakugo Katsuki was a wreck. Hisashi pulled away from him and shouted just barely caught the pathetic whine that tried to fall out of his throat at the motion. He felt his head being tugged out of the man's shoulder, a hand on his cheek angling his face to look at Hisashi. His husband's face pinched oddly as he stared into his eyes. The look of concern only amplified as Shouta almost nuzzled the hand on his cheek, reaching up to lace their fingers together. He blinked, eyes staying shut slightly longer than usual, then met Hisashi's eyes again. With a significant amount of effort, he pulled back from the blonde man and stepped towards the blonde teen, fingers still laced with his husband. The teen met his eyes for a moment, the crimson rubies framed with pinkish scleres and puffy eyelids. He looked so young, like the child he was. Shouta was reminded once more that his students, despite their power, really were just kids. He didn't want to forget it again. He reached out with a tentative hand, making sure to keep it in view, and placed the hand on Bakugo's shoulder. He ignored the violent shake that attacked the teen's body and gave the shoulder a squeeze. "Come on, kid, Izuku's in here," he heard himself say as he started to lead both the blondes into Izuku's room. Bakugo led the charge, stepping quickly through the doorway and shaking off Shouta's hand in the process. He only halted his movement when he was already several feet into the room. He stopped abruptly, a foot or two away from Izuku's bed. Yagi was still sitting at the teen's right, though now he had another chair pulled up beside him. He noticed there were now 2 chairs pulled up on Izuku's left as well, and he gave the former hero a grateful look. "Why's he snoring? The nerd never snores." Shouta snorted. He could blame his sleep-deprived brain, or the fact that they were off campus, or that he was going through caffeine withdrawals. In reality, it was just the pure oddity of the situation that caught him so off guard. It all seemed so utterly ridiculous that the snort had left him before he had the chance to stop it. Everything was just so ridiculous. Izuku had a quirk, a mutation quirk that was being drugged into submission by his mother. He was fucking All Might's successor. His formerly thought deadbeat father was in reality an underground pro hero with no idea of Izuku's existence, who was the older brother of one of the top 10 pro heroes, Ryukyu. And that was just what he'd figured out in the past 24 hours. No, not even, in the past 15. And the first question Bakugo Katsuki has is why the kid is snoring. "Fuck is wrong with you?" Bakugo demanded, turning back to give Shouta a glare. "Caffeine withdrawals," he replied, stepping swiftly to grab his untouched coffee. Hisashi let out his own snort and slapped a hand to his face. Shouta gave him a deadpan glare, and he chugged half of it in one go. It was cold, but it was coffee. He was feeling better already. Hisashi's eye twitched. There was an uncomfortable bout of silence, and Shouta watched as Yagi adjusted himself in his seat. "Bakugo, my boy, why don't you take a seat? Why don't you tell me what the fuck happened?" The teen interrupted, crossing his arms in front of him. "Bakugo, sit," Shouta demanded. Bakugo held his gaze for a few moments, a silent battle playing behind his eyes. He grumbled and took the seat Yagi offered to him, leaning back and propping his chin up high, arms crossed in front of him. Shouta followed Bakugo's lead and led him and Hisashi over to the seats on the other side of Izuku's bed. "So, what the hell happened last night?" the teen growled, barely a second after his teachers were seated. Yagi cleared his throat and twisted so he was facing Bakugo. "Young Bakugo, I need you to understand that anything we tell you absolutely cannot leave this room. It is of the utmost importance." "Yeah, I get it, old man," he interrupted. "What? You think I can't keep any more secrets, eh?" The challenge in his tone was palpable. Less than a day ago, this would have left Shouta with the same perplexed expression his husband was sporting. Now, however, he wasn't in the mood for a pissing contest. "Yagi has told me about one for all," Bakugo Shouta stated, getting a look of shock from his student and offense from the former hero. "Aizawa-kun, and we will be having another conversation about that later," he continued, pushing through Yaga's interjection. Bakugo fixed him with a challenging glare. He held the teen's eye until Bakugo blinked and pulled away. He slumped into his chair, face pointed towards Izuku, chin tilted down. Not in defeat, but in defiance. Whatever, get on with it before the nerd chokes on his own drool." His voice was a few decibels quieter than usual, and Shouta didn't miss the way Bakugo's gaze stayed glued on Izuku's sleeping form. Okay. He caught his husband's eyes, his face filled with questions. Later, he mouthed. Hisashi responded with an almost imperceptible nod. Okay. He took a breath. Last night, I received an emergency message from Izuku. When I arrived at his apartment, he was on the couch. His heart had stopped. I pressed my own panic button and began to perform CPR. Paramedics arrived after ... some time. He really wasn't sure how long he'd been alone with Izuku before Ems showed up. He was too preoccupied to notice how much time had passed. Yagi seemed to understand as he continued where Shouta left off. 26 minutes. Aizawa-kun had been performing CPR for most of it. It took 26 minutes from the moment his panic button was pressed to when actual Ems arrived on the scene along with myself and Detective Tsukachi. The two of us actually had to pull young Aizawa away so the paramedics could do their work. Yes, Shouta intervened. He didn't need to think about how much he'd fought against the people who had been there to help. He didn't need to think about how he was so panicked he hadn't even realized they were there until he was shoved away. He couldn't help the glare he shot at Yagi. The man ignored it. They restarted his heart with a defibrillator. One of the paramedics' quirks was used to upchuck the rest of the drug out of his system. We checked him into the hospital after. Fortunately, there's no permanent damage from the cardiac arrest. The drug is still being tested last I checked. He finished, eyes glued to Izuku and his chest tight. He hadn't realized how heavily he was breathing until his husband's hand was pressed into his. Hisashi gave his hand a couple of rhythmic squeezes. He returned them and forced his breathing to slow, eyes fixed now on the blonde teen instead. Bakugo was hunched in on himself. His fists kept clenching and unclenching on his thighs. He looked up and his eyes bore into Shouta. So you found Deku on the couch. What? Fucking passed out. What the hell was his mom doing? Auntie should have noticed. Shouta's eye twitched. Bakugo calls Inko auntie. Fuck. I knew they grew up together, but I didn't realize they were close like that. Thought him at Yagi. You better be right about telling this kid the truth. Izuku's mother stated that she believed he was napping. The word was almost spit out. He wouldn't have believed the woman was as stupid as to assume that if he hadn't been told it was true by the human lie detector himself. He didn't know how anyone could mistake what the kid looked like as anything other than dead. He gripped Hisashi's hand tighter. Bakugo continued, his hands now fully clenched, shoulders shaking. So why isn't she here now? She must be worried half to death. Auntie always cried even more than Deku. Fuck, this is it. Inko is currently in police custody. Hisashi gasped. Bakugo froze. The drugs used on Izuku were found in their raw form in her bedroom. In the leftovers she'd packed for Izuku to take back to the dorms and in the dinner she made for him. The room went silent. The tension was deafening. Hisashi's grip was like steel. That's fucking bullshit. Bakugo yelled, jumping to his feet. Auntie would never lay a fucking finger on Deku, let alone fucking drug him. What the hell do you idiots think you're on? He demanded. His words were filled with blind conviction. Yet again, Shouta found his gaze drifting to Izuku, the boy who, despite all the yelling and tension in the room, remained peacefully passed out. His relaxed and alive form a violent dichotomy to the limp, lifeless state he was in the previous evening. She did that to him. Yagi stood to his full, commandeering height of over 7 feet and placed a hand on the teen's shoulder. Said teen was nearly vibrating with rage but froze again with the contact. Young Bakugo, she admitted it to a detective with a lie detector quirk. It's the truth. You're serious, Bakugo stated, his voice small and pitching upwards in the last syllable, almost a question. Yagi gave the teen's shoulder another squeeze. His gaze flickered over to Shouta, his brows pinched in resignation before responding. Tsukachi has already begun an investigation as to where she got the drugs. The overdose itself was an accident, but the drugs were intentional. What the fuck? The kid yelled, twisting out of Yaga's grip and stepping away, his hands wringing together, letting off little, controlled pops. Shouta had to suppress the instinct to use his quirk. Why, what did she even give him? Bakugo demanded, a hand coming up to grip at his hair, like fucking anti-anxiety meds or some shit. Deku's always been anxious as all hell, but quirk suppressants, Shouta interrupted. Bakugo's eyes widened, then narrowed into near slits. Since he was 4, she's been giving him quirk suppressants. He heard Hisashi suck in a breath beside him and his fingers tightened their grip. Bakugo stilled. No, Bakugo denied. Yagi stepped up again, attempting to place a hand on the teen's shoulder once more. Bakugo flinched away aggressively, the flinch itself almost masked by the snarl he shot at the former hero. Yaga's face fell, clearing, not missing the actual flinch. He took a slow breath and lowered his hand. Young Bakugo, I understand this is a lot of information all at once. Maybe we should move somewhere a little more private. The kid's body jolted like it had been struck by lightning. No, he shouted, his expression filled with terror before he schooled it back into a scowl. Then the scowl dropped as well. I mean, fuck I. His lips pursed into almost a pout as he faced Shouta, eyebrows pinched inwards. I'll be quieter, but I'm not leaving Deku. He paused again and slammed his eyes shut, a deep breath raking through his body. Don't make me. Those last words were more of a whisper, almost a plea. Shouda's chest tightened. "I won't," he replied. Bakugo's eyes snapped open, a look of confusion flickering across his face before it was schooled into neutrality. He held the teen's gaze for a moment and gave him a short nod. The kid huffed out a breath and broke eye contact. With a gentility very unlike him, he sat back in the chair beside Izuku's bed. The piercing rubies now focused back on the form of the unconscious teen. Yagi stared for another moment, a look of pride crossing his features and a gratuitous smile aimed towards Shouda before he followed into his own chair. 3 full minutes of silence was what followed. Shouda counted the seconds, none of the older men in the room willing to break it as they watched Bakugo compose himself. A myriad of emotions stretched across his features: confusion, anger, disbelief, worry, all displayed in silence as he sat staring at Izuku, the only sounds in the room being breathing and the occasional pop from the teen's hands. Shouda was so proud, regulating his quirk and his emotions. This sort of moment wouldn't have been possible only a few months ago. Such was the reason they gave the teen all the time he needed. No one dared push past the unspoken boundaries set by the explosion-quirked boy. They waited until the crackling pop stopped and the teen's strict posture began to falter, until he began to fill the silence with tentative words in a tone rippling with vulnerability. "Deku's quirkless. He's always been quirkless." They waited with bated breath. There can't be. I would have known. I would have seen that shit. We fucking grew up together. I would have seen it. I should have seen it. The teen's head dropped into his lap, hands tugging at his hair, posture hunched forwards. They waited more, giving Bakugo another minute to himself. "Why?" he asked. From his angle, Shouda could just barely see the kid's face, his eyes wide and unblinking in his own lap. Why the fuck would she do that? Why would she ruin his life like that? He took a shaky breath, then exhaled loud and slow. Shouda had a feeling that he wasn't actually asking any of them. After the long breath, he untangled his fingers from his hair and sat up straight again. Shouda dutifully ignored the splotchy red covering his face. The kid rubbed at his eyes and sucked in a forceful breath, then exhaled in a growly sort of sigh. As the kid's shoulders relaxed, the tense atmosphere of the room eased. The old hag, she should be his secondary emergency contact after Inko. The sudden shift in the energy of the room had Hisashi letting out a soft sigh. The grip his fingers had on Shouda's own loosening ever so slightly. Yaga's stiff posture eased and even Shouda felt a slight wave of calm wash over him. While the change of subjects seemed initially strange, Shouda was grateful for it. The teen was asking questions he didn't have the answers to. And even if he did, he wasn't sure he would have been able to answer. Yagi must have shared a similar sentiment, because then he smiled. Not his wide, heroic savior grin, but a softer one. "Would you like us to contact your mother, young Bakugo?" he asked. "No," the kid screeched, a wild, manic look flicking across his face, his eyes wide and doe-like. Lips slightly parted and an aggressive popping coming from his hands before he smothered them on his wrists. The calm was very quickly replaced by concern. The teen bit his lip, then shook his head as if he was trying to reset his brain like an Etch-a-Sketch. Don't call her. She's not Deku won't." Bakugo growled and smacked his forehead with his hand. An action so very unlike the usually outwardly violent teen it caused ripples of worry throughout the room. The skin on his wrists was pink and tight where his hands had been. Yagi was staring at the boy with pinched brows and thin lips. Hisashi's hand was still clutched in his own, palms now slick with sweat. Then in a much quieter voice, "The nerd can't handle her, okay? She's not nice like he is." For the first time in the several months Shouda knew him, Bakugo was trying to look smaller than he was. Bakugo Katsuki was trying to hide. Yagi looked to be on the verge of tears, his face tight and concerned, his lower lip trapped in between his teeth as he worried into the flesh. The facial expression mixed with the disgusting mess of a shirt he was wearing and the frazzled hair on his head was enough for Shouda to take over the conversation. As words of UA he started, Bakugo's face snapping towards him. "The school is not required to contact anyone for either of you." The immediate relaxation of Bakugo's expression had a blade stabbing into Shouda's chest. A childlike expression of relief decorated Bakugo's face. There was no reason any child should feel the need to hide from their parents. Fuck, they were just children. Something fiery burned in Shouda's gut. A deep, raw sort of rage that had been building from the moment Izuku's emergency communicator went off. These kids deserve safety. They deserved kindness and love and respect in people who wanted what was best for them. People who were willing to protect them, to fight for them. He might just be their teacher, but in that moment, he promised himself to be that person. For both these two, and all of his students, it would be a cold day in hell before he let anything happen to them again. There were several minutes of silence that followed. A silence that if he had to put a name to it, he would describe as shell shock. The silence that came after your ears stopped ringing from an explosive boom. The silence that seemed to seep into everything, leaving an unnatural dullness over the world before it sharpened into acute crystalline clarity. Silence that seemed to seep into open pores and fill the empty space and fog. Silence that broke too easily, its fragility a frightening contrast to the thick blanket it layered on after a mind-breaking kaboom. Yagi began, gaining the sole attention of the room as the silence shattered at his lips. His mouth gasped, opening and closing in apprehension, seeming to notice the sharp glass-like edges of the quiet stinging his tongue. He paused, frozen, before his gaze locked onto the paper bag left abandoned on the nightstand. He stood up and grabbed the bag with a shaky grin, the paper crinkling under his grasp, further crushing the silence into shards. I brought breakfast. There should be plenty enough for everyone. He pranced away, stepping behind and past Bakugo's chair and deeper into the room. Shouta almost immediately felt the emptiness of his stomach aching with hunger. He stepped further away and grabbed the edge of an adjustable rolling table that was leaned against the far wall. He flipped it upright with an unnaturally large hand and quickly set it up. Once unfolded and stood on four-wheeled legs, the bag landed on it with a soft thud. He wheeled the table over, pausing for only a moment before sliding it over the hospital bed and within it, the sleeping Izuku. He began to open the bag, taking out folded white plastic containers of various sizes. I had hoped that Midori, Izuku Shounen would be awake to eat ... but I can always order more later for my boy. The man rambled, tone reminiscent of the boy he spoke of. As he placed the containers on the table, one popped open and Hisashi gasped. Suddenly the sweat-slick hand quickly left Shouta's as he jumped out of his chair. Are those waffles? My man, waffles are my absolute favorite. Where the freaking heck did you order those? His husband questioned, his joviality and brightness shattering the final sharp pieces of the numbing silence. Yaga's face lit up as he continued to open the containers filled with various European pastries, and lo and behold, fluffy waffles that seemed to be drizzled in chocolate along the corner. There's this lovely European bakery just south of here. He smiled. I became quite fond of the pastries during my time in the States, and I was pleasantly surprised to find such good replicas so close to UA. His grin seemed to be contagious, as a similar one quickly spread onto Hisashi's lips. Wow, big guy, you're gonna have to show me the place sometime. I haven't had good waffles since I was in Tokyo, you dig? The older man's face pinked, but his smile didn't falter even as his eyes dropped to his hands as he undid a particularly stubborn lid. You had waffles last week, Shouta interjected, settling more comfortably in his chair with a small teasing smirk falling onto his lips. Hisashi gave him a playful glare, pulling his own lips up into a mocking pout, his hands floating up to rest on his quirked hips in exaggerated annoyance. Shao, you know what I mean. Making them at home isn't the same. He whined, his pout falling quickly to match his husband's sly smirk with a mischievous grin of his own. Immediately, Shouta forced his own expression back to a slightly bitter neutrality, causing Hisashi to pout at him once more. I'd be honored to take you sometime, Yamada-kun, Yagi suggested, staring at him and Hisashi with thinly veiled amusement, his cheeks still pinker than normal. He had to resist another quirk of his lips at the sheepish reaction. He knew all too well that flustered expression. He wondered how long it had been since the former number one had been out with colleagues, or anyone really in an act so normal as visiting a bakery. A sudden image of the former hero, alone in a penthouse suite eating a feast like this in complete silence, entered his brain. A pang of not hunger rumbled through his guts at the thought. He snuck a glance at the unusually quiet teen, seeing him looking at the interaction with furrowed brows and a pinched cheek, like he was chewing the inside of it. Like he was, like Shouta, resisting a fond smile, and the sadness the previous image brought was easily washed away, replaced by a wave of protective fondness as his eyes slipped from the secretly amused teen to the still sleeping one in the bed below, a line of drool connecting his face to the pillow, then back to the slightly more relaxed, explosion quirk teen as his wide eyes took in the feast of sugar unfolding in front of him. This time, he didn't fight the upwards quirk of his lips. Bless these big-hearted blonde doofuses. They certainly knew how to shatter awkward silences. This is enough food to feed a fucking army, the teen muttered, speaking for the first time in several minutes. Shouta couldn't help but agree, eyes fixed on the six-pack of muffins, 2 different pies, take-out container of at least 8 waffles, second container of waffles. These ones match a flavor judging by the color, 6-pack of red bean buns and several containers of jammy fruit and maple syrup. The entire assortment was mouth-watering, but far too much for what was planned to be 3 people eating it. The former hero let out a sheepish chuckle and brought a hand to rub at his neck. I suppose you're right. I'm not quite used to ordering normal-sized serving, he muttered. For a moment, his presence seemed to shift, the sheepish nature falling away to an aura of grandeur. If he was able to, Shouta was almost certain he would have poofed up into his muscled form. In my prime, this would have been an average breakfast of mine, he stated, his voice bright and loud, pride lacing his tone. A wistful smile crossed the man's face. Then it fell abruptly, along with the grandiose aura, leaving behind a shell of what was there. A shell of the hero the man once was. Shouta's gut tightened. The former hero's fallen expression stretched into a rather forced-looking grin. I don't eat even half as much as I used to. Downsides of not having a stomach, I suppose. That was news to Shouta. He was aware the injury that caused All Might's time limit had been bad, but he hadn't been aware that it was organ destruction level of bad. Shit, at least it saves money, Shouta tried to add. The obvious attempt at a joke sadly failing to loosen the tension brought back into the room. Hisashi's face fell into a soft smile. Hey big guy, that's alright, it just means you can share your favorite foods with more people without going bankrupt, he brightly added, finishing with a honey-sweet chuckle that would have had a younger Shouta pink all the way to his ears. The former hero's grin turned more real at the response, his cheeks pinking again and a curious expression doping over his features that had Shouta suppressing another smile. Sleep deprivation, it turned out, really limited your ability to repress emotions. TCH, Nimari's been warning me it would catch up eventually. And to think I denied all those times she offered to put me to sleep. I'd probably pay her to make me sleep for a week if I had the chance. Now, I like that way of thinking, Yamada-kun, and it really does save on money, Aizawa-kun, Yagi complimented. Shouta felt an embarrassing heat present itself on his cheeks before he forced it away. Yaga's large hands finally opened the last takeout container. And young Bakugo, please do not sulk about my condition anymore. Things would have turned out this way anyways. I'm simply glad I was able to use my power in a final act of goodness. Do you understand, my boy? Now it was Bakugo's turn for pinkened cheeks. The sudden call-out from the former hero startling him out of what Shouta was certain was a spiral of self-hatred if the context he had from Bakugo's and Izuku's most recent altercation was still being rectified. TCH, I get it, old man, he grunted, twisting his head away from the former hero's careful gaze. Yaga's face seemed to soften even further. He pulled out several paper plates and wrapped utensils from the takeout bag, laying them out over the table with clumsy motions, almost knocking one of the trays off in the process. Good, Yagi smiled. Now, I hope no one minds a late breakfast. At 1:47 p.m., he was certain it could no longer be considered breakfast. Nonetheless, the sentiment remained, and now that Shouta was more sufficiently caffeinated, he was able to actually enjoy the meal. The peace food often brought was not unfounded at this moment. While some tension in the room still remained, it was softened by the sweet pastries and tentative conversations swelled in part by the blonde man Shouta was lucky enough to call his husband. Though still missing many fundamental details about the situation, Hisashi was not only able to, but thrived in dragging the awake recipients of the food into polite conversation ranging anywhere from the details of what they were eating to school and teacher-related jargon that he somehow managed to make interesting, a feat Shouta couldn't help but marvel at. The food was, admittedly, delicious. He took a surprising amount of pleasure in smothering the pastries with the jammy fruit and what tasted like authentic maple syrup, a rare commodity in his diet. Hisashi, despite proclaiming his love of waffles, seemed particularly partial to the fruit pies and muffins, taking down a slice of each with easy pride. Despite bringing the delicious food and raving about his love for it, Yagi ate a surprisingly small amount, only taking a single small serving of the pie and a waffle. Bakugo was busy gnawing on one of the red bean buns and eyeing the cherry pie before finally accepting the slice of it Hisashi offered to the teen. The observant shit no doubt watching Bakugo eyeing it and taking the matter into his own meddling hands. The matcha waffles remained completely untouched, and Shouta had a sneaking suspicion that those were bought specifically with Izuku in mind. The teen who still, throughout all the talking and moving, remained asleep, a fact that was beginning to concern Shouta. He knew that the teen's body was likely exhausted. However, with his new sensitive hearing, he would have expected Izuku to at least have stirred. Alas, that was not the case, and the lack of response was beginning to become worrisome. While the blondes were preoccupied, Shouta slipped out of the hospital room with a practiced grace. It was crucial he stayed updated on any information Tsukachi had for him, and he didn't trust himself not to taint the oxymoronic light environment of Izuku's hospital room. Now, contrasting to his earlier check, his notifications were much more manageable. A few from the Hero Commission's group email, new rules, violations, things to watch out for, and the most recent heroes to gain their licenses. One from Nedzu, pages and pages of information he'd collected about late-onset mutation quirks, studies, and his own observations and ideas. It was his form of support. It was a lot. The damn rat's social skills were often abysmal, his care shown in strange ways. Shouta fought back a fond grin. 2 more emails, random promotions and newsletters he ignored. Then one from Tsukachi, 2 video clips attached. Inko's first and second interrogations. He saved the email, wanting to go through both later when he had more privacy. A second interview meant the case went deeper than just Inko's abuse of Izuku. Things were more serious. Then he moved on to his personal messages. The class group chat had settled down. He'd bet the kids had another one without the teachers they were blowing up. But as long as they weren't getting too invasive or annoying him, he was fine with it. Bakugo leaving probably hadn't helped much with the panic. That was an issue for later. His personal messages from Tsukachi were more pressing. There were several sets of messages that had come through over the past few hours. Lie detector. The lab just finished with a full workup of the suppressants. We understand its composition now. He's been being used as a test subject, eraser. Each batch was slightly different than any others, and the drug itself has a similar makeup to trigger. Lie detector. It's possible the same group is distributing both drugs. How Inko has a personal connection to them, we don't know. Lie detector. She won't share any more information. Aizawa. This isn't looking good. The lawyer she has is a fucking weasel, but she's damn good at her job. Lie detector. Inko. Her former foster father, Haru Chisaki, was leader of the Shihasekai. She moved out of his home the moment she turned 18. However, we've found records of monetary transactions into her account from an unknown third party that we think may be from them. Lie detector. Eraser. Your student might be on the surface of some deep shit. Lie detector. Kuraii is with me now. Ryukyu confirmed his story. Now all we need is a DNA test. He wants to see the kid. I told him no for now, but he's worried. Been separated from his kid for long enough, I think. How's Greenie doing? Shouta paused, hands frozen over the keyboard of his phone, eyes raking over the messages. He'd dealt with the Yakuza before, and he'd heard of the Shihasekai, but they hadn't been properly active in years. It was rumored the boss had gone soft and there was some sort of internal power upheaval. Was it possible they were responsible for creating those drugs? If Izuku was the test subject, did that mean they were yet to perfect them? That they were still in the production testing phase? Shit, this was not good. He glanced another look into the hospital room's doorway. The food was now cleaned up and Hisashi seemed to be walking Bakugo and Yagi through the JSL alphabet. Bakugo took to the motions easily, a look of concentration on his face while he signed the whole alphabet in repetition. Yagi was having more difficulty with it, Hisashi taking the time to show him tricks for the more complex signs and meticulously repeating them when requested. Izuku was still asleep under the covers. Would it be fair to destroy this piece by allowing Kuraii to visit? To have to explain the further complexities that appeared as they uncovered more about Izuku's life to Bakugo and Hisashi? Was it fair to Kuraii, or Izuku even to deny his visitation? 16 years without knowing each other, and now the simple legality of it and a paranoid teacher keeping them apart. Would Izuku even want to see Kuraii? Did it matter? Lost in his own thoughts, he almost missed Hisashi standing from the side of the bed and walking up to the open doorway. His formerly bright face now fallen to the true concern and confusion Shouta knew he was feeling this entire time. He stepped out of the room and gently closed the door behind him, leaning up against the frame as he spoke. "Shu, baby, can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, his features painted with concern. The eye bags he had showed much more prominently now that he wasn't smiling. He shook his head slightly to clear his mind and gave Hisashi a nod, letting his own face soften into a fond look and holding out a hand which his husband took with fervor. "Of course, Zashi. Let's find an empty office and I'll explain. I owe you that much," he responded, squeezing the hand held in his own and starting to walk Hisashi away from the room. The hand squeezed back easily. "Yeah, you sure do, asshole," Hisashi complained, a pout falling along his lips as he let himself be dragged down the hall. "You sure mighty and explody boy will be good on their own with Greenie." Shouta paused for a moment, thoughts freezing even as he kept walking. Again, he shook his head, trying to reset things like he was an Etch-a-Sketch. They'll be all right. It's not the first time those three have been alone together. A wave of fury flooded through him as he remembered the finals set up for the two only months beforehand. Then he took a forceful breath. Being angry at Yagi for something he was physically incapable of doing again wouldn't do anyone any good. He had more important things to be angry about. Besides, I think Bakugo needs some time with Izuku, and Yaga's a decent mediator for those two even while the problem child's asleep. He continued. Despite how overly aggressive Bakugo and Izuku's final turned out, the former pro did manage to get the two to work together, which was, needless to say, impressive at the time. He knew the man had made some stupid decisions, but he trusted him to keep the students safe, and now that he had gone through Netsu's mandatory teaching program over the summer, it was unlikely there would be any more incidents like it again. Hisashi nodded in response, likely following a similar train of thought, and fell into step with Shouta, side by side now. It wasn't much longer after that they were able to find an empty office the doctors didn't mind them using. It was a simple space, small with only a single bed and chair and an old computer sitting in the corner. It was likely used for individual, non-emergency examinations. As the office door clicked shut, Hisashi almost immediately jumped on him, grabbing Shouta's cheeks and forcing eye contact. Hisashi's eyes were welled up in tears and his lips were quivering pitifully. "Shouta, I swear to God, if you ever pull a stunt like that again without telling me, I will gouge out your eyeballs and feed them to Kuta's bunnies," he threatened, his voice dead serious but shaky. Hands coming down now to wrap around Shouta's neck in a partially intimate and partially threatening way. Shouta just chuckled and wrapped his arms around Hisashi in return, pushing the man's head to tuck itself into his shoulder. He could feel Hisashi practically melt into the soft touches and comforting hold within moments. Any and all tension he held just melting out. He dutifully ignored the wetness soaking into the skin of his bare shoulder. His sweater was still being worn by Izuku, so his tank top left them exposed. "I'm sorry, Hisashi, I swear I'll make it up. I'll even take a fucking vacation day for you so we can have our night in." Hisashi pulled away suddenly and stared at Shouda's face with suspicious, red-rimmed eyes. "Who the hell are you and what have you done with my Shouda?" His face broke into a gentle, soft grin. Shouda leaned in and pressed his face into Hisashi's neck, arms coming to settle at his waist as he hid his own smile. "You're Shouda, huh?" he teased, giving his husband's neck a playful nip. "All mine," Hisashi responded, kissing the top of Shouda's head. Arms still wrapped around his neck, one coming up to brush through his thoroughly knotted hair. They stood like that for a while, just holding each other, Hisashi's hand trying to unknot the worst parts of his hair with his fingers. It was exactly what Shouda needed. "I'll bring you a comb and some clothes later, Kay," Hisashi suggested, breaking the silence. The softness had Shouda almost start crying. No judgment, no anger, just understanding and love. Hell, he wasn't sure he'd ever get used to how lovely this whole marriage thing was. "I love you so much, Sashi," he breathed, the words spilling out of him easily. He felt a sudden spike of panic in his chest and squeezed his arms around his husband tighter, words coming out shaky. I just can't leave him right now, all right." The arms then tightened around him and Shouda let out a shuddered breath. It was all coming to him now. All the panic, the pain, the sadness, the strife and the anger all hitting him at once. All painted across the flashing images of his student. Green hair, purple tongue, lifeless, cold skin and no pulse, floppy limbs and fuck he was so cold. Then light blue hair stained with red, cold pale skin stained red. No pulse, cold skin, floppy limbs and so much red. In and out, chest compressions for 30 seconds then 2 puffs of air. Keep the heart going, keep him alive. He can't die, he can't die, he can't die. Not here, no. Please no. I can save him. Come on please. Don't worry baby, I get it. Just, then he started sobbing. A thick, wet sound that pulsed against his throat, ripping through him in howls he couldn't control. He felt like he was choking, on his own breath, on blood, on his guilt. He couldn't save him. He couldn't save his best friend. He was gone. I couldn't save him, Sashi. He was so cold he was gone dead. I couldn't save him. He barely registered being moved onto the bed. His arms and legs tucked into Hisashi's lap as the man rocked him back and forth in his arms, barely noticing the gentle coos and soft shushing and the hand still in his hair. He's gone now. He's gone and I couldn't do anything. Yesterday I couldn't do anything. He wouldn't wake up, Sashi. Fuck, I felt his ribs break under me and it didn't work. He heaved out his breaths, each one like a punch to the gut. Memories mixing together, twisting and flipping around, molding into each other. 20 minutes, Hisashi, 20 minutes of CPR and he just wouldn't wake up. I couldn't. He looked so young, just like him. He was so small, Zashi, just like him, and I couldn't save either of them. The cooing paused for a moment, and he just registered the sudden uptake of breath from his husband. A moment of understanding between them. The realization of why this moment in particular was hitting Shouda so hard. He buried himself further into Hisashi, his breath slowly down slightly as the arms around him tightened and the hand in his hair resumed its rhythmic movement. "Oh baby, it's okay. You saved him all right. You saved Izuku. He's here because of you. Because you kept his heart going until the paramedics got there. You saved him, Shu. He's okay. You did it. It was just like Burrow. He was so cold and I thought I was too late. You weren't. You were right on time, Shu. Okay. You saved him. He's alive. He's alive because of you. He's alive because of you. Yeah, Izuku was alive. He did make it. The kid was alive. His problem child was okay. He did it. Aburo wasn't. Aburo was dead." Shouda sobbed. Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification. So when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.